Hi, and welcome to In Search of Insight, Nootropic Depot's monthly podcast. I'm your host, Erica, and sitting next to me is our product specialist, Emil.
Hey, everyone.
Today, we are back with episode 23, for real this time, of the In Search of Insight podcast, and we're looking forward to talking with you about a very well-known supplement, something that Emil and I have both taken quite a bit from time to time, which is Bacopa Monnieri. We're going to be talking about the different varieties of Bacopa products that we offer with Nootropic Depot and their effects. We're going to be talking about why some people respond differently to our stronger standardizations of Bacopa extracts versus our newest Bacopa product, which is Cognance. And of course, Emil, being the formulator of Cognance, is going to tell us all about why that is happening. But before we get into that, we are going to start by taking the Bacopa.
Yes, and for this episode, the main focus is actually going to be on our, what we call generic Bacopa. So for a long time, we sold patented Bacopa extracts, such as Synapsa and Bacognize, but we wanted to have a Bacopa extract that had significantly higher Bacoside levels, and that just didn't really exist on the market. So we went out and made our own Bacopa extract, which we call Bacopa. Well, we don't call it Bacopa, but in the Reddit spheres, it's become known as Bacopa 24%. That's referring to the fact that it has 24% Bacosides by HPLC, UPLC testing methodologies, which we'll touch on in a little bit as well. That's quite important. But for now, we'll be taking this one. I believe, just in terms of regular Bacopa, this is for sure our strongest one. And I've been taking it every day for the last, I think, month and a half now, coming off of many months with Cognance, because I wanted to see what does normal Bacopa do that Cognance doesn't, and what does Cognance do that normal Bacopa doesn't. Erica has also done that test, but you've had to abort that test, and we will get into reasons why in a second. But because I am taking it regularly, I'm going to take a little bit of a higher dosage. I've also seen some reports on Reddit that people are saying they get very nice mood boosting effects with a higher dose. So I will take 2 tablets.
Okay.
Do you want to take 1 or 2?
I'm going to take 1 tablet.
Okay.
So we're going to take our doses of this Bacopa, and we're going to feel what the effects are like over the course of the podcast. So you might see our behavior change a little bit, or maybe not. Our speech might change, but we'll share with you exactly what we're feeling as the podcast goes on. And cheers to your 2 dose.
Cheers to your single dose.
All right, so before we get started talking about Bacopa, we are also going to address the strange-looking elephant in the room, which are our new microphones.
I just wanted to bring that up. Yeah,
Good.
I'm glad you did.
Awesome.
We've been having some issues recording in this room. We can maybe share a picture of this room at some point. It has really high ceilings, so you can't really see that because the video cuts off about here. But it has really high ceilings, which can create some weird echoes. So I've been trying to figure out ways in which we can limit that. We were doing lavalier mics for a while. That worked okay, but you're still picking up a little bit of the more of the room noise with a lavalier mic.
Especially because the microphone is still quite far away from your mouth, and for us, depending on the length of your neck, it can be extremely far away. The sound isn't very clear, so it's not as nice to listen to.
Yes. So another reason why the lavalier mics weren't working properly is because most lavalier mics have an omnidirectional pickup pattern. So I bet you weren't expecting us to get into some audio nerdery, but I think it's interesting just to have a quick discussion about this, because you see a lot of podcasts using the same microphone, Shure SM7B. It's big, kind of gets in the way. It sounds okay.
It looks super cool, though.
I think it looks terrible.
Well,
so no offense to the podcasters that are using it. There's a good reason why it's being used, and one of those is the pickup pattern is a polar pickup pattern. So, it's a cardioid pickup pattern. Most lavalier mics are omnipolar. It means they pick up everything. So they pick up kind of in a sphere. If you had a cardioid one, which is only picking up the front and not the back, that would have actually been much better. But cardioid lavalier mics are very expensive. They don't really exist. So we didn't really want to go down that route because we also have had some bad experiences with lavalier mics. In the past, however, we were recording in an extremely well-treated room, our music room that we had set up for speakers. I had a lot of acoustic treatment in there, and we were recording with very large microphones with a cardioid pickup pattern. This sounded really good, and we've been missing the sound ever since we came here, and we don't have our treated room. So we wanted to find a solution. One of those solutions is going with a cardioid mic again, and you heard that in the last podcast episode. We had the mic that we used in our treated room. That's a cardioid microphone, but it's pretty big, especially on a stand. It really gets in the way, so we wanted something a little bit more unobtrusive.
And elegant.
So I started looking at some boom microphones that they use in professional movies. They'll hang it above your head. So these microphones in a movie would be hanging right about here. So they're actually still pretty close to me then, but as you can see, my hand is out of frame. The microphone is out of frame. So that's usually how movies are being recorded. But that's oftentimes also being done in a more well-treated room. So one of the ways to get rid of a lot of the room reflections is to just be as close as possible to the microphone. So that's why these microphones are in view, but they're still out of the way. They're not in front of our faces, so I think that works well. They have a cardioid pickup pattern, so that's nice. And I like the fact that they're made by a Swedish company, so they're very close to us. It's just a single guy making these microphones. So these are the Line Audio CM4 microphones, and we did something interesting with them. So we've been doing a lot of testing with this Rode stereo bar here. We wanted this Rode stereo bar so we could do one of two things. Either have two microphones, one very close to each other's mouths, to get the most up-close sound and the least room reflections.
A little bit of an ASMR vibe, if you know what I mean.
Exactly. But then another thing I had in mind is there is this miking technique called ORTF, and everything goes in stereo then. So we've been doing a lot of testing over the last week, and we found that when we put the microphones in an ORTF setup, which is this, so they are angled 110 degrees outwards and spaced apart 17 centimeters, and that's being noted here. You might be able to see ORTF there. So the capsules are lining up exactly there. What we noticed is that there is still a little bit of a room reflection, but it sounds more natural. When it was just a single microphone, the room reflection sounded a little bit harsher. Our voices also sound a little bit more natural on ORTF, but the one thing is, it is now in stereo. So this means if you like to listen to our podcast with just a single earbud in, you might not be having very good audio, because if you have your right earbud in and Erica starts talking, Erica's voice will be a little bit lower in volume than my voice. So my advice to you, if you do like to listen like that, it is no problem. I've seen this kind of listed as an issue people have with stereo podcasts. But what you can do is you can go in your phone or in your computer and you can just say that you want all the stereo to be summed to mono. This means that both stereo channels will go into one earbud, and then you'll be able to hear us fine. For those of you that are listening on a speaker or are listening in earbuds, it should sound a lot more natural, and it should kind of sound like you're sitting in front of us. So this ORTF, it's designed, or the concept behind it is that the microphones are spaced apart just like your ears are spaced apart. So this should be picking up just like our ears are picking up. And one kind of novelty that we can do here is that this is now a binaural recording. So check this out. If you are wearing headphones, this might blow your mind. All right, so you should hear it kind of going around your head.
It's pretty amazing.
This is some nerdy stuff. I figured I would get it out there. I know there's probably some other people who are doing podcasts or are into audio or are audio engineers and are curious what's going on here. That's that's what's going on.
We're making changes all the time to get the best sound that we can and the best video quality that we can, so it's really fun to experiment. And it's also really fun because Emil is super knowledgeable about audio science in addition to supplement science, so this is something that you just love to do in your free time anyways, and it's cool that we can apply it in this format because it makes the podcast better and it makes the whole experience just more immersive for everybody.
And I think that's kind of a common feature between scientists. I think a lot of people who are interested in one professional field of science oftentimes have a lot of hobbies in the sciences too. So I know, for example, Jay, our lab director that we've had on, we talked in the past also about how he's really into aquariums. If you ever get a chance to chat to Jay about aquariums, it's crazy the amount of science that goes in there and the precision. And he's also a beer brewer, and I brew stuff and ferment things. And there's a lot of science that goes into there, which can kind of enrich our lives as well and keep us motivated to keep innovating with things like this, because ideas that we have outside of this scope can actually inform our decisions on certain extracts. So for example, if you look at these microphones, you can have something that picks up everything in a 360-degree radius, maybe a full spectrum Bacopa, or you can have a microphone that has a cardioid pickup pattern and is only picking up the front and not the back. It's getting more selective. That's maybe moving over to more something like Cognance, which we can skim the back of it. We can make it more cardioid. We can make it more focused. We lose some things, but we gain certain things. So going from an omnipolar to a cardioid microphone, you would lose a lot of interesting stuff that's potentially going on in the back. Right now, there's nothing interesting going on in the back, so it works in our favor. Or actually, there's stuff going on in the back, the room reflections that are not good, and we want to get rid of it. And that's also something when it comes to Bacopa that is important. So one of the reasons you had to abort your experiment is because
Bacopa 24% does not work for me.
Makes you really tired.
It really, really doesn't work for me. It makes me really tired. And it also gives me this feeling of irritability, but the kind of irritability like I have when I'm feeling quite hungry. Sometimes tiredness doesn't always manifest in feeling sleepy, but it can manifest for me in feeling really frustrated or like I'm fighting against something, even though there's nothing to be stressed about, there's nothing wrong. I can just feel really on edge and like this internal kind of scratchy, annoying thing that's just gnawing away. And I didn't expect that to happen with Bacopa because in the past I've taken it and it's been really relaxing. Although over time, I noticed that for me, it starts to build up to the point where I lose some motivation, but internally then I have this kind of dialogue that happens. And basically I feel like I don't have the energy or the focus to accomplish what I want to. And I'm also tired. So it just kind of makes me feel like a bit of a 4-year-old inside, and then I might be really relaxed, I might fall asleep easier, but in terms of everyday life, it actually gets in the way rather than making my life better and more relaxing. On the complete flip side, I really like Cognance, and Cognance is something that I've taken for quite some time, although we're not taking it currently in our stack. I'm not taking it currently in my stack.
And we're not taking it currently because we wanted to actually switch to normal Bacopa Monieri.
Yeah.
We've had, I believe it was 7 months or so, maybe a little bit more of daily Cognance at 2 capsules, so 200 milligrams. And we just washed out for a little bit for like a week or two. And then we started on normal Bacopa Monieri. I really wanted to compare the two. I've always loved Bacopa Monieri. I've taken it in the past. But through the development of Cognance, I compared them a little bit here and there, but not extensively in the last couple of months. So I wanted to see, is it any different than taking Cognance daily? And it's hugely different. For me, actually, it's really positive. I am missing a lot of attributes of Cognance, but it is, in a sense, a little bit better, and better in the sense that it has a very nice calming effect, and I really like that calming effect. For Erica, it makes you tired. So it's always interesting that you have to play around with these things. And one of the reasons why I wanted to make Cognance and why Nootropics Depot as a whole wanted to make Cognance is because we've all had these experiences that we get a little bit tired from Bacopa, and it takes a really long time for the nootropic effects to truly kick in. With Cognance, that's not totally the case. It hasn't really made any of our beta testers tired. It's not something... I've seen a few people mention it on Reddit, but generally Cognance does what it's supposed to do, and it gives you a lot of the benefits of Bacopa monnieri, but it doesn't make you tired. So we can go into why that is a little bit later.
Yes.
I think for now we normally would focus on some new products, but we wanted to actually... we don't have any new products now.
Yeah.
So
our new products were isoliquidogenin and our new Erinaceus lion's mane mycelium product, which we discussed both of in our last month's podcast.
And took, actually, because you took Erinaceus and I took Erinaceus and isoliquidogenin together.
Yes. So if you're curious to hear more about those products and get our take and our experience, what it feels like to take those products, you can go over to our last podcast episode. And that's probably a perfect moment to just suggest, if you aren't already subscribed to our YouTube channel, definitely click the subscribe button below. Also give us a thumbs up if you like this podcast. And check out our subreddit. That's r/Nootropics Depot, because we talk about new products, we talk about the podcast, we talk about our mushroom grow operation, and lots more science on Reddit every single day at pretty much every hour of the day. So definitely get looped into our ecosystem and follow us. Now that I've said all of that about our new products, also about subscribing to the In Search of Insight podcast, what we are going to do instead of talking about new products is we're going to talk about an update for the mushroom kingdom.
So new research instead of new products.
Exactly.
And we have some really interesting stuff to share, actually.
Yes.
As you might all know, what we discussed in the last podcast with Jay, and actually the one before that too, we've now had kind of 2 back-to-back podcasts dedicated little sections of it to the Mushroom Kingdom project. That's, for those of you that are not yet familiar with it, it is a project that we set up. It is something that I set up right before I had to leave the US, actually. And in that project, we have a really big tent. And that tent is climate controlled. So we can control the humidity in there, and we can control the amount of airflow in there. Temperature, not so much, but we have very consistent temperature in the location where it is. So we don't really have to worry about that. But we can modulate CO2 levels, oxygen levels, and we can modulate the humidity and light. So with all of that, we are then growing 21 different cultivars and species of lion's mane. And with species, I mean different Hericium species. So lion's mane is Hericium Erinaceus. And you also have different species, such as Hericium Coralloides. It looks very different too. We can show some pictures of it here, probably.
Yes.
That might work. So Hericium Coralloides, it looks a little bit like coral. It has a very interesting look to it. We've been cultivating that one. We've been finding some interesting stuff there. We also have different species like Hericium Abietis, Hericium Americanum, and a few different species there. And then lots of different cultivars of lion's mane, Hericium Erinaceus. So, for example, we have one that was found in the wild in the Pacific Northwest. We have one that was found in the wild in Philadelphia, or around Philadelphia. What's the state called again? Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania, you got it.
So close to Philadelphia in Pennsylvania forest. Actually, a lot of mushroom research and activity is coming from that area. It seems to be a really good growing area for mushrooms. And I think we have one from Virginia. We might even have one for Texas. I tried to find some in Arizona, but I ran out of time. But there actually, crazily enough, are areas in Arizona where you have Hericium Erinaceus and Americanum growing. You have these cloud forests in Arizona, which are higher elevation and higher humidity areas where a lot of mushrooms actually grow.
What's the difference between a cultivar and a species?
That's a great question. So a cultivar is the same species, but showing different attributes.
Oh, okay.
So, for example, if you have carrots, like you can have an orange carrot, but you can also have a purple carrot.
Okay.
It's not that the purple carrot is a different species. It is just a different cultivar of that carrot. A very famous example, of course, is in hemp and other related ones. If you look at hemp cultivars, some can also be a little bit purple. Some can smell more fruity. Some can smell a little bit more like gasoline or a little bit more skunky. And all of that is down to the cultivars. You also have it with coffee, for example. So you have Coffea arabica. That's what most of us are drinking. You also have
That's
Coffea.
the species?
That's the species.
Okay.
So you have two distinct species of coffee that we are regularly consuming.
Yeah.
Most people who are into higher end specialty coffee are drinking Coffea arabica. Those beans, that species of coffee, produces beans that are a little bit sweeter, a little bit more nuanced in flavor. They're also harder to grow. So those are usually reserved for more specialty coffee. Then you also have a different species called Coffea robusta or Coffea canephora. And that species is a little bit easier to grow. It produces higher levels of caffeine, and generally it doesn't produce the flavor complexity that Coffea arabica species can. However, if you grow Coffea robusta well and you select for different cultivars and phenotypes, so that's kind of the different attributes that it expresses, you can actually get very interesting flavors out of Coffea robusta. But if you're looking at it there, Coffea arabica and Coffea robusta, if you're looking now in Coffea arabica in the specialty coffee world, there are lots of different cultivars that have very different flavors.
So like bourbon or geisha or
Exactly.
this kind of thing.
Which are generally all Coffea arabica, but
Okay.
drastically different cultivars. So one thing you would see, for example, is certain Coffea arabica cultivars are very large. Some are very small. Some, like pink bourbon, for example. Pink bourbon cultivar can be very expensive. It is harder to grow. It is also more aromatic. So if you're growing it really well and you're processing it really well, you can get lemongrass type aromas and flavors from it. Something you can't get from other cultivars. With hops, it's the same actually. So if you look at beer in the US, has been very instrumental there, especially in the Pacific Northwest, especially in your home state, Washington State, has been extremely important for hop cultivation in creating different hop cultivars. So, for example, I think one of the first ones was maybe Citra.
That's the one that first comes to mind.
Yeah, Citra was one of the hops that was made way back in the day that now all of a sudden you could achieve citrus-like flavors with a hop. Previously, if you look at some of the hops that were being used in Europe and in England, a lot of those hops are a little bit earthier, a little bit more pure in their bitterness, and not as fruity and tropical. But through all of these different breeding programs now, you've been able to create cultivars that can produce mango-like flavors, that can produce lemon and lime type flavors and aromas. And that's really given rise to beers like the IPA. Anyways, going a little bit off topic there, but that's really the main thing about cultivars and species.
Okay.
So within hops, you actually do have a few different species, I believe, but I might be wrong there. With coffee, you have at least 2 species that are commonly used. There are others. And with Hericium, you have multiple different species and you have multiple different cultivars. So if we look at those other examples, like you can have the same species of hop, or hop is one species, so you can have hops, but you can have different cultivars that if you were to just smell them blindly, you wouldn't even say, yeah, that's the same hop as this one. The flavors and aromas are completely different. If we take those kind of lessons and the lessons with coffee cultivars, and we apply that to lions and hemp, and we apply that to lion's mane, then do we see the same thing? And no one's really investigated this. So that's one thing we wanted to investigate.
With the Mushroom Kingdom and the whole Grow Project, right?
Yes. And people have been doing it. So if you look at mushroom cultivators, especially people that are doing it well and are really going deep into the cultivation science and the art of cultivation, there are a lot of very skilled cultivators throughout the US and Canada, and they've been doing a lot of work on trying to find lion's mane species that grow really robust, produce a lot of biomass, grow well in certain conditions. So for example, there are cultivars that can grow in 90-degree heat or plus, so like 30 degrees Celsius plus. Whereas if you take a normal lion's mane cultivar, maybe one from the Pacific Northwest, and you expose it to those conditions, the lion's mane simply won't grow. So you can see really big drastic changes there, where you can grow something in high heat now, or you can grow one in much colder conditions, or you can grow one with different types of humidity levels, or one that colonizes the substrate much quicker, or one that grows more quickly and more vigorously with more biomass.
Not only is this going to change the way that the mushroom looks, but it's also going to change what's inside the mushroom too.
And that's what we're most concerned about. So in my mind, the ideal situation would be we find a cultivar or a completely different species that does kind of three things. It grows very fast, it produces a lot of biomass, and it produces a lot of bioactive compounds. Growing fast and producing a lot of biomass, that's pretty easy to determine. We can just see, okay, how many weeks did it take to grow? And then just weigh the mushroom and compare it to the amount of substrate that we had and see what is the efficiency there. How much biomass are we creating? Because ideally, you want to be as space conscious as possible. And there's also some environmental concerns here as well, because when you are cultivating mushrooms, you need a decent amount of water to keep the humidity up and some electricity to keep a mushroom tent running. So if you can have a mushroom tent produce 1,000 pounds of mushrooms per flush, compared to maybe 750 pounds of mushrooms, then it is, of course, much, much better to be able to achieve that higher biomass with the same amounts of inputs, the same amount of fanning, the same amount of humidity, which is not totally true. Mushrooms actually expel CO2. So if you have more biomass in there, then you have to get rid of more CO2, a little bit more air refreshing. But that's another interesting thing. Maybe there are certain cultivars that put off less CO2. Who knows?
That's what you're researching.
That's what we're researching. But those two things we can quite quickly determine. Now, the more difficult thing is, what are the bioactive differences? So there's a lot of research we can go off. So for example, if you look at Hericium coralloides, there are NGF and BDNF active compounds in there that enhance the synthesis of both NGF and BDNF that you don't necessarily see in other Hericium species, or at least in higher levels. And those are called the Coralloidins. So we're going to be looking at Coralloidin A through C, specifically in Hericium coralloides, because it is a completely different species that we're growing now. It still contains the same hericinone type compounds and hericines and hericerins that Hericium Erinaceus contains, and it seems to also contain a new class of compounds that are not found in Hericium Erinaceus, but there is research out there showing it is active on NGF and BDNF. So that's really interesting, because that's kind of what we want lion's mane for. So that's one thing. So one problem with that is we don't have the reference standards for the hericinones, the hericines, the coralloidins, the hericerins. So we have to make those.
Okay.
We made our Erinacine A reference standard by just extracting huge amounts of lion's mane mycelium biomass, and taking that lion's mane mycelium biomass and then taking the Erinacine A out of there and purifying and getting it certified through NMR analysis. Now we have hundreds of milligrams of Erinacine A reference standard that we can now use to analytically test lion's mane mycelium to make sure it actually contains Erinacine A. Now, one huge ally in this mushroom kingdom project will be if we have the reference standards for the hericinones, the hericines, etc. Because then we can take samples of different mushrooms that we've grown, different cultivars, different species, and see quantitatively with percents how different are the levels. We can't do that yet because we still have to make those reference standards, but there is one interesting thing we can do. There's this thing called HPTLC, High Performance Thin Layer Chromatography. And we will flash, maybe right here, Erica,
Yeah.
in editing, we can flash a little plate here. And we looked at some earlier, so we can kind of both tell you our experiences with looking at them. But basically, an HPTLC plate is almost like a fingerprint. Every botanical has a unique fingerprint. And this is actually a technique we use to certify all of our botanical supplements. So for example, when Bacopa monieri comes in, we want it to be Bacopa monieri, not Bacopa Coralloides. I think that's another species. Maybe that's cool too, by the way. I don't know. But we want Bacopa monieri. And the only reason, or the only way we can make sure it is actually Bacopa monieri is to either do like a DNA analysis or to do something like HPTLC.
And HPTLC is measuring the different compounds in the botanical, right? Or the raw material?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, no, sorry. It is not quantifying it.
Not quantifying
Yes.
it. Okay, but it is measuring the contents in terms of differentiating levels of certain contents in the botanical, right?
Not entirely, but
Okay.
it is a kind of a confusing thing. That's why I instinctively said yes, but it's also no, because we can't say, hey, that is so much percent of this compound.
Okay.
Necessarily. There are certain techniques where we can adapt HPTLC testing to do that.
But you can say, I see more concentration or I see a brighter band at a certain compound. So you're not measuring it in terms of a number percentage-wise, but you are measuring for the specific compound by name, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So if we look at what I'm assuming right here is an HPTLC plate. You have some lines there. Maybe I'm by chance hitting a line here.
This is your weatherman training.
My weatherman training. I wish I could see it, but somewhere around here, you'll see kind of one band, and it's all on the same line. And you'll see colors, and each band has a different color.
And each band is signifying a different compound.
Yeah, so the really crude way this works, and we actually do this in a lot of our mushroom research, we do an even more, HPTLC is pretty high tech, by the way. It's a huge station in our lab. I'm sure Jay will do a video about HPTLC at some point. It is a very big station. You can also do TLC, thin layer chromatography, which is like the low-tech version of HPTLC. And it's very easy to do if you know what you're doing. Basically, you take a special kind of card, a special type of material that wicks. So if you take, for example, a piece of tissue and you dip it in water, especially if you did it maybe with like some cyanidin 3-glucoside in the water, you could see through the capillary action, it would take up that water into it. TLC and HPTLC work in a similar way, but basically what they do is through the capillary action, they can actually separate compounds and deposit them at different points based on their molecular weight.
Okay.
So if you take an extract of lion's mane mycelium or bacopa or whatever botanical we do, and you deposit it on one of these plates, it will slowly suck up and deposit the compounds based on their molecular weight at different positions.
But the extract would need to be in some kind of liquid solution, right?
Correct. A liquid solution that is completely filtered. There's no sediment in there. So that also means you have to have some sort of sample prep methodology through sonication or whatever we deem is necessary to actually extract those compounds. And then you take it and you put it on a plate. And then that plate will separate out those compounds. When you look at one of those plates, you won't really see a whole lot. With TLC, you can kind of see it discolors certain areas. With HPTLC, if you look at it, you won't see a whole lot just with the naked eye. But then you put it in a special piece of equipment.
That's where the high performance part of the acronym comes in.
Yes. You put it in I believe it's called a visualizer. It puts a certain wavelength of light on it. Different wavelengths correspond with different compounds. But then those compounds fluoresce. So when those compounds fluoresce, that's what we're seeing here. So you see all of these pretty colors. Those pretty colors are basically those separated out compounds fluorescing. And if we do it over and over and over and over and over again, and with a lot of research, we can not super accurately. That's why I think we have an annotated one up here. Let's make sure it's an annotated one. You can see question marks. Is that an Hericium? We know certain things. So there's one band somewhere around here that's ergosterol. We know that's ergosterol. We've tested that before. We know exactly where it's showing up. But then the Hericiums, we have a general idea of where they should be showing up. And with that, with taking the first 7, I think, species and cultivars that we're doing in the mushroom kingdom, we have been able to see more bright colors for certain extracts. So remember, the extraction methodology is exactly the same. It's very standardized between every single mushroom biomass that we put in.
Okay.
So that's not making a difference. The thing that's making a difference is what's present in that mushroom. And what's present in that mushroom then is showing different fluorescence. And with that, we can now start to very preliminarily say, hey, that Hericium Coralloides might contain slightly higher Hericium levels, and we're seeing something pop up that we're not seeing in the other ones. So that's kind of where we're at now. That's the update. And we are on our 6th flush, and it is still producing lots of biomass. So
awesome.
We have now topped up our entire lab freezer. It's a pretty big freezer. It is now filled to the brim with lion's mane that's frozen and just waiting there until we actually have the capacity to extract it.
So
that's how much biomass we have now.
There's a lot of research to be done.
Yes.
There's a lot of research being done already, but it's really exciting to know that the mushroom kingdom is producing so much fruiting body. And you can also see it in the pictures that we've shown in this little update, all of the different cultivars and different species as well. As a non-true scientist, I am fascinated by all of this process like you, but there's so much detail and there's so much specificity when it comes to measuring these different mushrooms. And I'm just glad that we get to see the pictures and get these updates, because the project itself is amazing and it feels like it's growing at an exponential rate.
Absolutely. It keeps getting bigger and bigger. And actually yesterday we were on a phone call and we thought, hey, this is really cool. But how do we make this cool for you guys? So
we want to show you.
Well, we want to show you, yes, and we can do that. Not very easily, but we can show it visually. But how do we put the stuff in your body?
Yes.
That's the real
That's
challenge.
the coolest thing you can do.
That's the coolest thing. That's why we're doing this. At the end of the day, we can do all of this research just as a philosophical exercise. Almost.
Or for a pretty picture.
Or for a pretty picture. But we actually want to create kind of the next generation lion's mane fruiting body extracts. And no one's... As far as we know, no one's doing this. Like, there might be a little bit more of an artisanal thing going on. Like, if I grow this Hericium Erinaceus species and I take it, it feels different than this one. I actually recently had a very interesting conversation with someone who was involved with a project way back in the day in Canada where they were wild harvesting Hericium Erinaceus. And they had found one from a specific area that put everyone to sleep. This is really strange to me because there is nothing really in lion's mane, as far as I know, that should be able to put you to sleep. Maybe it was a mycologist's error where they picked what they thought was Hericium Erinaceus. Maybe it was something else. I don't know. But so there is some bioassaying going on there. As far as I know, just most people are getting their mushrooms from overseas, or there is some cultivation happening in North America. But once you start putting things into perspective, just how much biomass you need, it starts getting really crazy. So yesterday we were thinking, let's say we wanted to make 1,000 kilos of a 5:1 lion's mane extract. We would need an enormous amount of fruiting body, because the fruiting bodies are 90% water. And a 5:1 means you need 5,000 kilos of dried raw material. So then you're thinking of many, many thousands of kilograms of fresh fruiting bodies. And even though a tent can be very productive and you can just stamp it completely full of one very high producing lion's mane cultivar or a different Hericium species, realistically doing this on North American soil would be very hard. So we were kind of conceptually thinking, like, could we become mushroom farmers? We would love to, but I think it's going to be really difficult to do that. So we're kind of now in that stage of, we're starting to see some results. We're starting to get excited about that. Now, how can we apply that to something that actually produces real world results? And that's going to take a long time. So
for sure.
You're not going to be taking the next generation lion's mane fruiting body
grown
or
by Nootropics Depot.
Different Hericium. Yeah, that probably never. With a partner, ideally in North America, which we are exploring some very interesting options right now. Hopefully we can make that happen. And otherwise we will be working together with some of our regular mushroom cultivation partners, because the thing that I think there's a bit of hate these days towards overseas mushroom products, because you want to do it all on your own soil, and you want to have you want to oversee everything and make sure everything is being done in a clean way, etc., etc. I understand that, but the one thing is, we just don't have a whole lot of mushroom cultivators here. We don't have a long history of doing it. But if you look in Asian countries like China and Japan, Korea, there are hundreds of years of mushroom cultivation knowledge there. Malaysia, where our tiger milk is coming from, China, where most of our mushrooms are coming from. You have the expertise and the many years, maybe even centuries of mushroom cultivation knowledge that is there. You have the resources, you have the space, you have the people to do it, the know-how how to do it, and the extraction facilities that know how to do it. So be glad that exists. And there is some rhetoric that they're making low quality stuff. It's not true. They're making some of the highest quality stuff, and we're seeing that with analytical testing.
At the end of the day,
you have to do analytical testing then.
For sure. These different stacks and the different extracts that we take, a lot of that research, if not the majority of that research, has come about because of traditional practices.
Exactly.
Traditional Chinese practices and
or
Ayurvedic practice.
Which is what we'll be talking about with Bacopa very soon here, once we wrap up this section.
Yeah, exactly. So just to kind of put a little bow on the end of the conversation about the mushroom kingdom, there's obviously a lot that we still have yet to explore, but it feels like new boxes are opening up every single day.
Absolutely.
So that concludes our little Mushroom Kingdom update, and also our audio lesson for the month from Emil.
Yeah, hopefully you all like what you're hearing now. In our testing, it sounded much more pleasant, so
definitely.
Hopefully for you too.
Give us your feedback. Let us know how it sounds, definitely in the YouTube comments or on Reddit. We're really curious to hear how the changes and the updates are sounding for you guys. So now that we've had some time discussing these different projects, let's get back to our main topic for the day, which is Bacopa monieri. And let's start by talking about how we're feeling, because I can definitely feel that this Bacopa has kicked in already. And yes. Emil, how about you?
Absolutely. I was in the middle of a sentence earlier, and I kind of maybe even saw it on camera. I had this quick moment of like, whoa, something happened. I've actually never taken a double dose of the Bacopa. For some reason, I just never really was curious about it because one tablet is already pretty strong, and I really like the effects. The one interesting thing is I've been taking now this 1 tablet a day dose for the last month and a bit, month and a half, I think, at this point. But I didn't take it this morning because I wanted it to kick in with as much power as possible. And one thing I can mention is that throughout the day, we started recording at, 3 p.m.-ish?
Yes.
So waking up and starting my day at about 8:30, 9 a.m. Normally, I would take Bacopa right after breakfast, and the nice relaxing effects would kick in. I've kind of parsed out other relaxing things that are in my stack, because, for example, if I take Shodan and Bacopa together, the relaxing effect is too much, and I don't really like it. So I like just Bacopa or just Shodan, and I'm actually sort of more gravitating towards Bacopa. But that does mean I haven't had any of my the most calming part of my supplement stack, which is now Bacopa. And I could really feel that was missing. And one thing too is, like, my muscles felt a little bit more tight because that GABAergic effect allows me to relax my muscles a little bit more. It actually allows me to concentrate a bit more. It is easier then for me to be in a better mood. So that was missing. So now when it kicked in, I thought, yeah, that's what I've been missing. My mood is up, my body feels nice and relaxed, the tense muscles in my back have started to loosen up. I'm really liking this. The one thing I wasn't expecting is that it is almost like paradoxically stimulating, something we talked about in the previous podcast episode where you were having a paradoxical stimulation effect with coriander.
Yes.
And I said I haven't really been having that, but then people on Reddit were saying, oh yeah, I've had that paradoxical stimulation effect too. I'm getting that now from this. It feels like almost a little bit euphoric in a sense. And I saw someone mention that on Reddit, that if they take 2 tablets of the 24%, it almost feels a little bit euphoric, uplifting. And I have to agree with that. It is a fairly pronounced GABAergic, but also a little bit of like a serotonergic tinge to it. I really like it. What are you feeling so far?
So far, I feel a little bit more weighed down than I normally do. And in some senses, this could be interpreted as calm, although for me, I feel like my vibration is a little bit lower most of the time. I say that in a very casual way, tongue-in-cheek way, not really. But this is like bringing me even further down. Like, I feel super chill, like cool as a cucumber, maybe a little bit too chill in terms of my comfort level, because it makes talking and being engaged in the conversation feel maybe more taxing than I would like if I compare it to Cognance or if I compare it to other relaxing supplements that we take from time to time.
So yeah, again, you can see how big the change can be. The interesting thing is, back in the day, I also had very similar responses to Bacopa, which is also what made me chase down Cognance. So I'm not really sure what has changed. Something has clearly changed. One thing I think that might be happening is you actually stopped taking Cyanidin 3-glucoside.
Yeah.
I stopped taking it for a little bit to see what kind of differences I would notice without it, and I recently started it back up again. But for most of the experiment with Bacopa, I have been taking it alongside Cyanidin 3-glucoside. And Cyanidin 3-glucoside enhances norepinephrine levels, mostly through the monoamine oxidase inhibiting effects.
For me, that has been very stimulating lately. I took it one morning when I had an appointment to go to, and I've been doing some experimenting lately with my stack, removing a lot of the different mood boosting supplements and some of the calming supplements because I was feeling really tired and sometimes agitated. So I thought, I'm going to take out all of these mood supplements and see what my mood is like when I'm just focusing on vitamins and minerals and the basics. And then I was taking this basic stack and I added on Cyanidin 3-glucoside, and I was really sitting in this meeting, and all of a sudden I had this feeling of panic, and then I really had to use the bathroom, and my heart started beating and I got really warm. And for anyone who struggles with these kinds of issues like on a regular basis, this really didn't feel like a normal anxious response. This really felt like all of a sudden something changed inside of my body, and it made my stomach feel different, and it changed my whole experience. And so I thought, okay, I think I'm going to lay off Cyanidin 3-glucoside for a little while, because I was getting some really good benefits from it. I think it was really nice for definitely feeling like fit, and it goes really well with exercise. But some part of the stimulating aspect of it got really intense for me all of a sudden, and I think this might be causing some of that agitation I was experiencing. And I haven't been taking it for the last week or two, and I definitely feel more calm, more chill. I also feel like my sense of humor is back and I can relax a little bit more. It was pushing me just a bit further than I want to be pushed on a daily basis.
Yeah, and I think that's something I started to notice after a while too, that Cyanidin 3-glucoside can be very stimulating, especially when you combine it with other stimulating things. So I was also experimenting a little bit more with Sabroxy again. Tiger milk seems to be a little bit stimulating and seems to enhance norepinephrine levels. Lion's mane mycelium seems to do that too. I was taking cold showers every morning, which enhances norepinephrine levels. And at a certain point, I just felt like really reactive in my stress levels. So I stopped taking Cyanidin 3-glucoside. When I was taking Cyanidin 3-glucoside, I was also taking Shodan and Bacopa together, and that was fine. Then, when I dropped Cyanidin 3-glucoside, the Shodan and Bacopa together were making me way too chill. So I dropped the Shodan, and that was good, but now I've actually added back in the Cyanidin 3-glucoside, and I think one of the reasons I can now very well tolerate normal Bacopa is actually because of the Cyanidin 3-glucoside. Like the Bacopa monnieri is acting as the perfect counterpart to Cyanidin 3-glucoside, helping to balance out some of that beneficial stimulation that I get from Cyanidin 3-glucoside. And I love it when I'm by myself. If I'm just by myself and I'm focusing on something, that energy that I get from Cyanidin 3-glucoside is perfect. But if I'm around other people and we're doing something together, I can be a little bit more snappy, a little bit more reactive. I don't really like that in social settings, but combined with Bacopa monnieri and now without the tiger milk, without the cold showers and stuff like that, being a little bit more balanced on the norepinephrine front, it's working really well. With that in mind, if you are feeling a little bit weighed down, would you want to take a capsule of Cyanidin 3-glucoside to see if you can balance that out for the rest of the podcast?
Right now?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's see what happens.
Just a single one, or do you just want the full double dose then?
That's a good question. We were taking a double dose before, right?
Well, that's the full dose actually. So
okay.
Double capsule, 2 capsules, not the double dose. That's just the regular dose.
Okay, but before we were taking, I was taking 2 capsules.
Which is the regular dose.
Which is the regular dose. So let's just go for it. Let's take the full regular dose and see, because I really would like to know if that experience I had, if that's going to happen again. And I feel comfortable diving into that uncharted territory with you and just documenting it on video. And I'm also really curious because not only do I feel super chill right now, but there's one element of this euphoric kind of reverse stimulation. What's the term that you use for it?
Relaxation?
No, not relaxation.
Paradoxical
stimulation. There's one element of that which I find a little bit distracting in this scenario, and that is that I feel like my field of vision has gotten narrower, not wider.
So it is stimulating for you, but it's also making you very chill.
It's weird that it's both, because on one hand I feel like things are moving slower. On the other hand, I feel like my vision is narrower and I kind of have this tunnel vision. And so, Yeah, perhaps the language that I'm using to describe it is a bit confusing, but I feel a little bit like I'm in a tunnel and I'm moving slowly.
Okay.
Sometimes when I have stimulating supplements, I can feel like I'm in a tunnel, but I'm going at light speed. And in this case, it just is a little bit like, yeah, I don't know. If you poke me, I'm not going to feel quite as much, or I might not respond quite as quickly. And that's not necessarily ideal in like an everyday or work scenario or a creative scenario for me, although it's really nice when it's time to go to sleep and it's time to relax. And Bacopa is one of the ingredients in sleep support that makes it really, really relaxing and great when you wake up the next day, especially if you're a person like me who can feel a little bit on edge right when you wake up.
And that's kind of one of the things that I've always recommended. So if you do not respond well to Bacopa monnieri during the day, take it at night, because a lot of the memory enhancing effects take a long time to kick in and are very dependent on upregulations that are happening, on neuroplastic changes that are happening. So basically, you need it in your system long term, and it doesn't matter if you're taking it early in the day or later in the day. You just have to be taking it regularly. So you can take it at night and it actually enhances sleep quality. And one of the reasons it enhances sleep quality is because it actually contains the precursors to very similar compounds that are in other sleep promoting supplements. So for example, you have this thing called Sisyphus jujube, which is a kind of a date looking thing from China. It's from traditional Chinese medicine. And there it's used as a sleep promoting supplement. And one interesting thing is it contains, one of the main actives is Jujoboside A. And Jujoboside A, when it is exposed to acid hydrolysis, turns into Jujobogenin. Bacoside A, when it is exposed to hydrolysis and acid hydrolysis, also turns into Jujobogenin. And Jujobogenin seems to have a fairly strong GABAergic effect. So what we are experiencing now is probably some level of Jujobogenin is already present in our Bacopa 24%, and our gut bacteria and the hydrolysis that's happening in our stomach currently is producing Jujobogenin. These are also classically sleep-enhancing compounds that are found in sleep-enhancing supplements. So that might be where some of that extra chill feeling is coming from. It also means it is great for sleep. But let's try and balance that now.
Yes.
We can keep talking a little bit more in depth about it, but let me just quickly cut screen and I'll be back with a bottle of Cyanidin 3-glucoside.
Awesome.
And I'm back with some Cyanidin 3-glucoside.
Awesome.
So, here you go. 2 capsules. Also, sorry for teasing you with the Cyanidin 3-glucoside. I know we've been out of stock for a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of you are really hoping it will come back soon. This is my last bottle too, and it is about to run out as well. So I'm very excited for it to come back. The interesting thing is, and maybe Erica can actually put it right here. Mm-hmm. Someone was juicing red cabbage, just in a masticating juicer, actually the same juicer we used to have. And they're making this like almost black purple beverage. And they're saying it has some of the effects of Cyanidin 3-glucoside. And then someone else was blending up a bunch of blueberries. Maybe we can also put that here.
Yeah.
But anyways, there's some very funny posts on Reddit right now about the Cyanidin 3-glucoside shortage. To give a little bit of an update on that, something went wrong with the shipping company, so it has nothing to do with us or the manufacturer. The shipping company, something went wrong, and it's kind of just been getting shipped all over the world. It was in Japan for a while, it was in Hawaii for a while, it was back in China, so it's kind of just been bouncing all over the place, and no one can give us a clear answer on where it is. We are hoping to get it back as soon as possible. We ordered this in June, like we were very much prepared. The same thing, strangely, is happening to isoliquid-to-genin. So this was actually going to be an isoliquid-to-genin episode until we realized that we ran out of stock because all of you guys are really liking isoliquid digenin apparently, and it sold way more than we thought it would. Again, we ordered that second batch of material very soon, and it's also a little bit stuck. So those are two things that are kind of up in the air right now. Hopefully we'll have it back soon. But anyways, for now,
in the meantime,
you get to have a little bit of FOMO with Erica's experience stacking Bacopa 24% with a full dose of cyanidin through glucoside. So I would imagine in about half an hour you might start feeling so. As we go through this, let's check in with you to see how it's going.
Absolutely. And for those of you who are familiar with using the chapter function in YouTube, if you want to just check and see what it's like, or if anything has changed, 30, 40 minutes from now in the podcast, feel free to go down. There will definitely be a chapter that describes when the cyanidin 3-glucoside starts to kick in. And for anyone who's curious also to look back in the podcast about other info or things we've already talked about, you can just go to those chapters down below, and there's a lot of detail, and that will help you to just kind of parse through the information again and return to places that you want to go back to in the podcast. So while the cyanidin 3-glucoside is being digested and taken up by all of my receptors and changing my whole body and my whole outlook, my transporters, let's talk a little bit about our different Bacopa monieri offerings, and let's talk about the effects, the differences that we experience, why that might be happening, and really talk about the mechanisms that are going on when we take this Bacopa extract versus Cognance, and what was the point in having all of these different options available, because for some people it can be daunting to look through this variety that we have and to choose the Bacopa that's going to be best for you. But I think a nice place to start is talking about where Bacopa comes from and how it's traditionally used, and then we can get a little bit more into our current extracts.
Yeah, so Bacopa monieri has been used for a really long time. It's probably one of the original natural nootropics. There's a lot of human data on it. There's a lot of old descriptions of it from Ayurveda, ancient descriptions, where it was always considered to be something that is good for the brain. And so there's a class of herbs in Ayurveda called the Rasayanas. They're the rejuvenating herbs. And specifically Bacopa monieri, I think it's called like a Meja or Menja Rasayana. I'm not exactly sure on the spelling anymore, but that is a Rasayana that is specifically rejuvenating to the brain. So there's a long history of it for that. It's actually given to fairly young children already in India. I think after the age of 10 it is commonly supplemented in some groups as kind of a thing that will help kids study at school. Of course, this is not something we're going to officially recommend because, again, look at the back of your bottle. You have to be 18 unless you have some sort of other, maybe contact with a doctor or something. But let's not get into that. But it is traditionally being used from a fairly early age till very elderly ages. So it seems to also have some anti-aging effects, and it seems to kind of keep your mind fresh even at later parts in life. And traditionally, the whole herb is used and it's mixed with milk. You see this often in Ayurveda. You actually see it with ashwagandha too. Ashwagandha is oftentimes the root powder is mixed with milk to enhance the bioavailability. And that's actually a concept KSM-66 took to the extreme, and they used milk to actually extract ashwagandha roots. So that's why if you look on our product description for KSM-66, you'll see that it has a milk allergen, because they basically took that traditional concept of taking it together with milk and made an extract with milk. It's pretty cool. One of the reasons is because if you're taking Bacopa with a fat source, some of the compounds can absorb perhaps a little bit better. I think over time we've kind of come to learn that that's not always the case. If a compound is fat soluble, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to take it with fats. I personally take it after breakfast, which contains some fats. I oftentimes eat peanut butter in the morning. So.
Every day, actually.
Every day. Guilty as charged. some peanut butter and hagelslag. So that's my regular breakfast. So I am always taking my supplements with a fat source. But I have also taken it at later points. So my last fat-containing meal was many hours ago.
Mm-hmm.
And the Bacopa Monieri is kicking in full force with 2 tablets, of course. But it feels strong, so I don't necessarily think fat is really something that you need. But that's how it is traditionally used.
We've discussed this in the past when talking about bioavailability, and I think some of the details I remember from this conversation was that when you take something with a fat source, maybe the difference in absorption is there is a difference, but it's quite small. So in terms of the perceptible benefits, it's not going to be like a crazy difference than if you don't take it with a fat source. And then over time, it also doesn't seem like it makes such a huge difference in terms of the benefit and the effects.
And with unstandardized material, of course, it can be more beneficial to take it, to get every last bit of bioavailability enhancement you can get.
And by unstandardized material, you mean like just the plant material
just
itself?
Raw Bacopa Monieri. So Bacopa Monieri also, it's a semi-aquatic plant. It grows close to water. You can actually also grow it in aquariums. So if you go to any aquarium shop, if you see some green plants growing under the water, that might actually be Bacopa Monieri.
And if you go to a garden shop and you see plants with these very cute little white flowers, and we can put that picture on this side, right here, you can see the Bacopa Monieri flower is really, really common in nurseries all over the world.
And actually, it also exists in the wild in the US. So actually, our social media person, Samantha, she takes all of the pictures for what you see on Instagram and Facebook and a lot of the thumbnails and things like that. She one time went to a park to take some product photos, and she took some pictures, and I was looking at those pictures like, Samantha, I think you found Bacopa Monieri just growing in the wild. And we looked it up, and we referenced some botanical pictures and drawings, and it ended up being Bacopa Monieri, which was really confusing to me because I didn't realize it grew in North America as well, but it does. It doesn't seem to grow in Europe, but it does grow in North America. So if you go out in a swampy area, you might be able to find Bacopa Monieri. Just be careful. It is also very good at sequestering heavy metals. So maybe if you find Bacopa Monieri in the wild growing along a potentially contaminated stream of water, I would personally not take that.
Yeah, maybe not the best choice for your wild foraged salad or tea mix.
Maybe not so good.
Yeah.
This is one reason, of course, why analytical testing is important, and we test all of our Bacopa Monieri extracts for heavy metals, and we actually adhere to Prop 65, which is the California regulation, and it is super, super strict. Like, there's nothing else on the planet, I believe, that's as strict as Prop 65. It actually makes it really hard for us to source certain ingredients. And oftentimes we actually have to get special custom batches made that can fit the heavy metal standardizations that we want to hit, or standardizations cutoffs, because you will always have some amount of heavy metals. Like this water that we're drinking contains heavy metals. The food that we eat contains heavy metals. Everything contains some amount of heavy metals. So the whole trick with heavy metals is just limiting the amount of exposure that you get. And that's important to just test. So anyways, you can find it in the wild. Just be careful.
We can kind of fast forward from talking about Ayurveda to our extracts now.
Yeah, and there is definitely some crossover there too. So if you look in India and you look at Ayurveda, a lot of that was already being well documented and was almost being done in like sort of clinical trial-y type of things, just not organized how we would normally do it.
Or how we would do it nowadays.
Yeah. Doing it in a more rigorously scientific method. But in India, because Bacopa Monieri was so important and it was being used even in the modern day, There were clinicians who wanted to know exactly what it was doing. They needed a way to actually research Bacopa. And one thing with natural plant extracts and just plants in general is that they produce wildly different concentrations of bioactives and maybe even different bioactives.
I always think about what Jay says, a plant's going to do what a plant's going to do.
Absolutely. And also it has to do, maybe you get a different phenotype that's producing more of one kind. And then you actually, if you select for that, you have a new cultivar. That's kind of what we were talking about earlier. But the problem is, from one Bacopa plant to another, depending on where it's growing to, the soil composition can definitely change the bioactives that are in there. So from terroir to terroir, then, if we're using a fancy French word for it, and from cultivar to cultivar, and from growing season to growing season, and from farmer to farmer, the levels of the actives are always going to be different.
And that's why it's important to consider what extract you're taking when it comes to the Bacopa monnieri that you choose.
And how you standardize it. So if you standardize something, you can make sure that at least, okay, we have X amount of Bacoside A. The problem with that is, in India, when analytical methods were becoming more and more accessible, methods were being developed for Bacopa monnieri. They really wanted to know what exactly is going on in there. We've been using it for centuries. It's really important to us. What's in there? So then they developed some HPLC, high performance liquid chromatography methods to take out, basically it's columns, and in those columns, same thing we were talking about with the thin layer chromatography section earlier. Instead of having a plate that separates out the compounds based on their molecular weight, you have giant columns that then the compounds stick to different areas of the column and then go out at different time frames. And then it's something I'm not super comfortable explaining. We'll have Jay on, and go watch Jay's YouTube videos too, by the way. He'll explain stuff like this in great detail. But the issue with that is, if you look at the bioactives in Bacopa monnieri, there are these things called saponins. And saponins act like soap. So they foam up. You see this sometimes with certain botanicals. I'm not sure if pineapple juice has a lot of saponins in there. It might be, because if you shake it up, it gets really foamy. That might be the saponins.
If you know, let us know in the comments.
And if you take something like Bacopa monnieri and you put it in water and you shake it up, it will get quite foamy as well. But that foaming action makes a lot of the bacosides stick together.
Okay.
And then they're not separating out well in those columns. So that means you have basically a clump of these soapy compounds that are sticking in one area of the column and coming out at the same time and producing one singular peak. So then when you look at that peak, you have to go, okay, let's try and isolate that. And they did, and they isolated it, but they didn't isolate individual compounds. They isolated this conglomeration of different things because they didn't at the time know how to separate it yet. But it looked like one thing. You can't see it with the naked eye or with a microscope and see, oh, it's a bunch of different things stuck together. And on the HPLC chromatogram, it looked like one compound. So that compound was called Bacoside A. And a lot of research was focusing on Bacoside A and getting a standardized Bacoside A amount and testing Bacoside A in animal models, isolated. Now we know that Bacoside A is not one compound. It's 4 compounds stuck together. So you have Bacoside A3, Bacopa saponin C, Bacopacide 2, and Bacopacide X. Those make up Bacoside A. So now we have much more resolution, and we know actually we can separate all of those out. And when we buy our Bacoside A reference standard, you can actually go look this up on Sigma Aldrich too. If you look for Bacoside A, it will be a mixture of those all together in a way that would represent Bacoside A. Then you also have Bacoside B. We've actually never figured out what Bacoside B is. So we still don't really know. So we are testing our stuff for Bacoside A mainly. So that was step 1. Same thing that we're doing with the mushrooms. In order to standardize something, you need to have a reference standard. You need to know what you're looking for. And we already knew what we were looking for with Adenosine A. So we just had to make the reference standard. But back in the day, with a lot of these Indian researchers, they were starting from nothing. They had no idea bacosides existed. They had to isolate these compounds. They had to give these compounds names, quantify them, and make testing methodologies for them. But once that existed, you could go further from there and make a standardized extract. So there's a drug research institute in India called the CDRI, the Central Drug Research Institute. And if you look at Synapsa Bacopa, which we carry, Synapsa Bacopa is actually CDRI 08. So the Central Drug Research Institute of India realized we need to study Bacopa. And in order to study Bacopa, we need a Bacopa extract that's always the same. So we're not going to have these differing levels of bioactives. Every single time we administer this specific Bacopa extract, it's going to contain the same bioactives. So we can do it at different dosage levels, we can test different parameters, but we always have a constant. And that constant is CDRI 08, or as we know it now, Synapsa. I think in Australia it's called Keen Mind, but it's all CDRI 08. At this point too, with some of the complexities with the HPLC testing, where compounds are sticking together, another method was devised, UVVis testing. And this method of testing, oftentimes we see this happen a lot, it inflates the amount of bioactive. So if you look at our specification sheet now for Synapsa Bacopa, you will see that I believe it's like 8.2% or 8 to 9%. It's in that range. If you look at what it was with UVVis testing, it was 55% bacosides. So way inflated and not at all realistic. Another company, Bacognize, that we work with and we have their extract, actually it's Verdure is the company, they make Bacognize, the Bacopa extract. They used to be 45% bacosides by UVVis. And they were actually the first company to go, no, HPLC is more accurate. And when they did HPLC, they got 12%. So also kind of interesting, if you look at Synapsa, you have 55% bacosides by UVVis, but you only have 8 or so % by HPLC. Differently with Bacognize, you start with 45%, but you're ending up with a higher actual concentration by HPLC, which is 12%. I've always thought why this is, and I think I might have a little bit of an answer now to that as well. And it would be interesting to do some analytical testing here and maybe have a conversation with Jay later about this on the podcast. But one thing that Synapsa knew that we also now know and made a patented product for is that the bacosides can also be hydrolyzed, and when you hydrolyze them, they form bacogenins. And I can't find any concrete information that Synapsa is actually hydrolyzing their Bacopa extract. But if you look at certain research studies, looking at CDRI 08, you can see that they specifically wanted a higher concentration of bacogenins. So Synapsa might actually have some more bacogenins. And the interesting thing there is that when we carried just Bacognize and Synapsa, the rhetoric was always that Synapsa made you less tired than Bacognize. Bacognize would make you really tired, and Synapsa almost had a bit more of an uplifting effect. I don't totally agree with that. I remember one of my first experiences with Bacopa was with Synapsa, and it made me deadly tired. So I was also taking it together with ashwagandha, so maybe that's just not a great combination.
What's the standardization for Synapsa?
So 8% by HPLC.
Okay.
And it's only... Actually, from the manufacturer, it is 55% bacosides by UVVis still. We don't adhere to that anymore, and we do our own HPLC testing, and that's what we put on our specification sheet. So we don't say it contains 55% bacosides, we say it contains like 8% now, and that's what we go by. What we don't know is there maybe a secret bacogenin standardization that's happening? Perhaps, and maybe that's why with their UVVis method, we're seeing 55% bacosides, which is also not totally correct, because if they are doing bacosides and bacogenins, which are the hydrolyzed metabolites of bacosides, and they're lumping that all together in UVVis testing, and that's getting those numbers way higher, it means that their standardization is not necessarily correct, being 55% bacosides. But this is where things get a little bit sticky, because UVVis doesn't have a great ability to separate between all of these different compounds. So it kind of lumps everything similar looking into that method. So that's maybe why, if we look at Bacognize, it's 45%, but with HPLC, it's 12%, and with Synapsa, it is 55% by UVVis, but only 8% by HPLC. We've never really dug all too much into this, because when we get extracts from patent manufacturers and they're saying, oh yeah, it is standardized to bacosides, we can test, for example, the bacogenin content just for our fun, but because they are not necessarily standardizing to those compounds, if we start standardizing to those compounds, we might have to start rejecting batches because the bacogenin levels might be all over the place. But that's really the big difference, potentially, between Synapsa and Bacognize.
And when you took Bacognize, did you feel as tired?
I also felt quite tired on that.
Okay.
So I don't know what was going on at the time, but any Bacopa was really making me tired. And that's also what got me interested in Cognance, ebelin lactone specifically, which is a bacogenin. And it got me interested in, interested in ebelin lactone and making ebelin lactone in a way that's not synthetic, because the synthetic method is extremely hard and extremely expensive. But we can get into that in a second.
So to start, then, the biggest difference between Synapsa and Bacognize is the difference in the bacosides standardization.
Correct.
Okay.
And then also, so we had the 55%, we had the 45%, but then they all dropped lower. So then we were curious, what would a very high bacoside percentage look like? And we tried to get a 50% bacosides. That never ended up working.
By HPTLC?
By HPLC.
By HPLC, okay.
But we did get this one. So this is 24% by HPLC. And as far as we know, everything we've seen on the market, this is by far the highest standardization of Bacopa. So 24% bacosides. So that dosage of bacosides I just took, so 600 milligrams, because each tablet is 300 milligrams, 24% of that's a lot of milligrams of bacosides, especially when you compare that against the 320 milligram dose, I believe, for Synapsa, and 300 milligram dose for Bacognize. So there are some differences there, but the interesting thing with Synapsa is that if you do want a Bacopa extract that has the most amount of human evidence behind it, you have to go for Synapsa, because Synapsa is CDRI 08, and if you look that up, basically just go to Google and Google CDRI 08, and then at the end put NCBI. That will pull almost all of the scientific studies that use CDRI 08. Synapsa are keen-minded in Australia, and this is where a lot of the human data is on. And it's because a lot of that research was being done in India, and it's been, I think CDRI 08 has been around since the 1970s. So way older than we are. There's a wealth of information there. And because of that, a wealth of information on human use of Bacopa monnieri and all of the receptor targets that it's hitting. So in my opinion, Synapsa is, if you look at it from like a historical novelty point of view, super interesting. It's probably the first standardized Bacopa monnieri extract on the planet. There's a lot of research on it and it works well, and there is a slight potential that there is some interesting things going on there with extraction processing. I have dug into some of their patents, and I've never found the hydrolysis thing, but what I have found is that they also very tightly control the harvest window. Okay. So they know exactly when to harvest it for the highest amount and most diversity of bioactive. So I think that makes Synapsa very interesting. It's a really cool product. But if we're just going for feeling alone, I really love the 24% Bacopa that we have, our generic, the ND 24%. It has, when we first came out with it and we had some beta tests, our operations manager, Cindy, took some and came back half an hour and was like, Emil, it gives me a pretty nice buzz. You should try some. And I tried some too, and I had to agree. Like, it really gave me a very nice, uplifted, mood-boosting, GABAergic type of effect. And I've always loved it since then. That's also one of the reasons why it went into sleep support. At the time, it was making me a little bit tired. But the interesting thing that I have noticed is just looking through Reddit, a lot of people have mentioned that they got very tired with both Bacognize and Synapsa, but not so much with our 24%. So I'm not sure why that is either.
Yeah. I remember a few years ago, I started taking Bacognize, and I think I started feeling the built-up tiredness effect pretty quickly, and pretty quickly decided, no, this is not for me. It was really relaxing and really nice at first, and then after maybe a week or two, I thought, oh gosh, this is not going in the direction that I want, so I stopped taking it.
Yeah.
And I haven't taken Bacognize since then, just because I have no problem falling asleep. So that's not really something I need in terms of supplementation in my life. I do definitely feel this euphoric feeling, and maybe there's one thing that I notice, which is that it feels like colors are a little bit brighter.
Interesting.
Yeah, that could also be because it's a beautiful day outside. But I do think that there's a bit of a different sensory experience that I have with this Bacopa extract. It's not as dramatic as it is with Cognance. With Cognance, it feels like the world is full of flowers. It feels like there's a different kind of sensory perception that I have in terms of visual perception and feeling sensation and relaxation that I don't really get from the regular Bacopa extracts and not from the 24%. But now that you're talking about the specific reasons why Cognance is different and how you kind of got on the inspiration train to creating Cognance, it makes sense that the effects are quite distinct from the regular Bacopa extracts.
They are very different. And I think that kind of gets us in the perfect position to talk about the process that went into making Cognance. And we have already done an episode about Cognance, so we'll go way more in-depth in that episode.
And we can link it down below if anyone is curious to hear really the specifics about the process in creating Cognance.
But we'll do a quick overview here.
Yeah.
So basically, one of the things that got me very interested in Cognance, the process behind Cognance, is because I was interested in a compound called ebelin lactone. And the reason why I was interested in ebelin lactone is because in my research, it was maybe one of the only things out there, natural and not regulated things out there, that was acting specifically on the 5-HT2A serotonin receptor. And that's where a lot of those sensory perception enhancing effects are coming from. It's where a lot of microdose-esque type of effects are coming from, but also unique mood boosts, unique effects on focus, mood and motivation and those sort of things. And I was always curious, could we basically make a non-lethargic Bacopa? And my plan was then, we can. We just have to go for ebelin lactone because ebelin lactone doesn't seem to have an effect on GABA and it doesn't seem to have an effect on cortisol. And because of that, it shouldn't be very calming. So at the time, this was many years ago, I was asking some companies if they could synthesize ebelin lactone, and it was insanely expensive. It would have never worked. But then I also realized that ebelin lactone is always being produced in our bodies. And it's probably what's giving Bacopa monnieri a lot of its interesting effects. Now, the one thing I will have to say is, so it's happening in our bodies. We are producing ebelin lactone within our body. We just took this, an hour and a half ago or so? I'm not sure how quickly this actually goes. So clearly in about 45 minutes, we started feeling something. According to a lot of the research, the bacosides, so specifically Bacoside A3, Bacopa Saponin C, Bacoside 2, and Bacoside X, some of the other ones, they shouldn't be passing the blood-brain barrier. And they shouldn't be absorbing very well in the gut. Part of the reason for this, and we went into this quite in depth in the Cognance podcast and also in the blog, is because these compounds have a lot of sugar groups on them. So you call these glycosides. So a lot of compounds in nature are linked to these glucose groups, and glucose groups add molecular weight and make the compounds bigger. And a bigger compound cannot absorb very well. So one thing that happens with a lot of these glycosides is that when you consume them, the glucose group falls off, and then they become smaller in size and they can more readily absorb. We also talked about this with cyanidin 3-glucoside. You have cyanidin, it's being bound to a glucoside, and when you consume it, most of that glucose group is being ripped off and you're getting cyanidin. And it's probably the cyanidin that's active, not the cyanidin 3-glucoside specifically. Same thing here. The bacosides are not necessarily going to be pharmacologically active, but the aglycones, when the glucose groups get ripped off, those compounds can easily absorb and can easily pass the blood-brain barrier and will probably produce those effects. So when we took the Bacopa 24%, Bacopa glycosides, I think that's maybe our standardization too, it meant that once it hit our stomach and it started to dissolve, it immediately started to be hydrolyzed, both by just the water and acid that's in our stomach, but also by bacteria. And this is where a lot of interpersonal differences will come from too. So you have a different microbiome than me, and you have a different microbiome than us. So every time we take something like this that's dependent on something happening after the fact, there's going to be variability. Maybe you are producing way more jujubogenin and pseudojujubogenin from those bacosides than I am. Maybe I'm producing them more slowly, so I get a slower ramp up in effects. That might explain some of the differences we're having with it. But basically, that's what's happening. You get these very big sugar group ridden compounds, they're falling off, and then you have the base compound. And the base compounds are jujubogenin and pseudojujubogenin. And that's the same thing with Sisyphus jujuba. And those jujubosides are basically jujubogenin with sugar groups arranged in a different way than Bacoside A. And that's why it is a different compound. So even though it is a different compound, is jujuboside A having a pharmacological effect? Or is it only a precursor to jujubogenin? And is Bacoside A having a pharmacological effect? Or is it only a precursor to jujubogenin? And in my opinion, it's probably only a precursor to jujubogenin. That's why the effects don't kick in after like 15 or 30 minutes, which you sometimes have with compounds that just get to work right away. Like if you take dynamine, for example, I can feel that in 15 minutes. Caffeine, I can feel in half an hour or so. There's not a lot of metabolism that has to happen to that. But with Bacopa, it took a little bit longer. But around 45 minutes, an hour, I really started feeling it. But it's still ramping up a little bit now. It's still getting a little bit stronger. The muscle relaxing effects are getting a little bit stronger. I feel now very calm. And the paradoxical stimulation has kind of died down. So that's kind of interesting. But it does mean that things are changing and you are dependent on those Bacopa glycosides likely turning into the aglycones. But with that in mind, I thought, can we not just do that in a laboratory setting? Can we not, instead of relying on your bodies to do that work and then kind of being at the whims of interpersonal variability there in your microbiome and stomach acidity and all of that, can we skip that process? And can we do it in a way where we can even skip jujubogenin and pseudojujubogenin? So jujubogenin and pseudojujubogenin are likely what are causing the GABAergic and cortisol modulating effects, and that can make you tired. But jujubogenin and pseudojujubogenin, after further acid hydrolysis, turn into the bacogenins, which is also what Synapsa was talking about back in the day. So they must have known something is happening there as well, but they're just not very transparent about it. But you go from jujubagenin, pseudojujubagenin, then you have ebelin lactone, bacogene A1. It's bacogene A1 through A5, I believe. And I think ebelin lactone is bacogene A4. So, can you take those bacosides, turn them into jujubagenin, pseudojujubagenin, and then turn them into ebelin lactone and the other bacogenins? The answer is yes. And one way we found this out was we worked together with an Australian company. We said, hey, can you do this? This is a really crazy thing, but basically we want to pre-metabolize Bacopa. We want to expose it to an initial hydrolysis step and then an acid hydrolysis step to go from bacosides to jujubagenin, pseudojujubagenin to ebelin lactone to the bacogenins. They said, sure, we can do that, easy peasy. Well, it wasn't, and the first extract they made was incomplete. So we had a mixture of probably no more bacosides, because I think that step is quite easy. Ripping off glucose groups is really easy. It happens all the time. If you look at studies for cyanidin 3-glucoside, for example, that is only one glucose group. But if you look at radio-labeled cyanidin 3-glucoside, there is no more glycoside after a while, and it all turns into cyanidin at a certain point. Probably the same thing with the bacoside. So that step is really easy. And when it came to us, the ebelin lactone concentration, we were hoping it would be 10%, but it was way lower. And when we tried it, to me, it felt like Bacopa 24%. That kicked in very quickly and had a little bit of an extra interesting sparkle to it. So it felt quite GABAergic in like 20 minutes, 30 minutes. You can immediately feel this GABAergic effect and then this kind of sensory enhancement effect. At the time, we were really trying to go for this microdose type of effect. I was not convinced by it. We did some testing. We found that it was incomplete. We talked with the partners in Australia, and they said, yeah, it was incomplete. We have to go back to the drawing board and try and do it more complete. So then the second batch came. Oh, and that batch did make you tired. Definitely made you tired more quickly and more profoundly even than Bacopa 24%. So
you definitely don't want that.
Yeah, complete failure, but an interesting experiment there. Mm-hmm. But a lot of people really liked that one, by the way, because it did feel different than just Bacopa by itself. And then we got the second one. And the second one was interesting because when a lot of people tried it, they were expecting to feel kind of the same thing they felt with that previous one, but stronger. But I already had in my mind that it's probably not going to do that. It's going to be more laser beam focused. There's going to be something very interesting going on there, which you've never felt before. But you have to kind of be tuned into what's going on. And for the average layman person, it's maybe not going to be the easiest effect to pick up on because it is going to be quite subtle and it is going to be very microdose-like. So when it came, it had exactly this effect. The owner and I immediately picked up on it and we said, yes, this is exactly what we were going for. No more GABAergic effects, super clean, cognitive enhancing nootropic, super interesting. Some of our colleagues were not so impressed by it though, and they liked the other one more. But we knew now, and this really confirmed that the jujubagenin and pseudojujubagenin compounds are very GABAergic and are causing a lot of the lethargy. And we can just completely skip those. So when it's happening in your body, there's no way to skip that. You are generating jujubagenin and pseudojujubagenin, and you are going to absorb those, and you are going to have those effects. There's no way around that. You are going to end up with ebelin lactone at some point, but there's no way to just have ebelin lactone. But that's what Cognance is. Cognance is just ebelin lactone, 10% ebelin lactone, and then the other stuff is likely the other bacogenins, which also have interesting effects. But yeah, that's Cognance, and why you respond well to Cognance and not necessarily to Bacopa 24%.
Yeah, amazing. It's really fascinating to hear you talk about the process and to follow each part and the creativity actually and the stick-to-itiveness that it takes to get from a really traditional botanical like Bacopa, especially in these really intense and intensely relaxing and sometimes intensely sleepiness-inducing extracts to something that's really completely devoid of that effect and something that has maybe what we're hoping for to get to in the center of the extract, so to speak, which is the cognition benefits.
Exactly. So yeah, it is actually a very creative process. Often with science, you have to think outside of the box and you have to think together with nature. And I think that is really the approach I'm oftentimes going for. So instead of going, nature doesn't know what it's doing, I can do it better, I can just do 98% pure this or that and synthesize it in a lab. Yeah, we can do that, and we do that, and it's great to do that. But sometimes that's not possible, and that means you have to basically consult with nature and look, what is nature doing? And it's making these glycoside compounds that are breaking down in our bodies. Is this something that was planned by design? I don't think so. I don't believe in that kind of stuff. But it is interesting that these things are going on in nature. We can learn from that and we can replicate that in a very nature adjacent way. So we can take modern science, modern techniques, analytical techniques, acid hydrolysis techniques, and apply them to natural extracts to kind of elevate those to the next level. And that's what we did with Cognance.
It reminds me of what you talk about, which is that science can be an art, and that, like you're saying, emulating nature or just taking some wisdom from nature, what's already there, and then from that point jumping off and being creative with how you can get to an effect that is, beneficial. You leave some of the things behind that you don't want, and it still is true to the kind of traditional uses of the botanical as well.
Yeah, and especially if you look at some of the research of CDRI08, where they were clearly somehow, I don't know how they were doing it, but they were prioritizing the bacogenins. And if you look at simulated pharmacokinetic studies, the bacogenins, including ebolin-lactone, then have superior bioavailability and bioactivity. So it makes sense to go for those. And we get those anyways, but just skipping some of the GABAergic effects.
Yeah.
That does mean that for some people, like myself, who actually really enjoy the GABAergic effects of Bacopa 24%, you're missing something. So going back and forth, so having taken Cognance for the last, since the release, which I think is about 9 months ago, we took it since the release, but 2 months ago, we stopped taking it with a bit of a washout period to then go into Bacopa Monieri. Having that experience of 7 months of Cognance and now a month and a half of Bacopa 24%, I am clearly missing something that Cognance is producing. There is a sparkle, there is a mood boost, there is a sensory enhancement and focus enhancement and clarity of mind that is nowhere near 24% Bacopa. It is not even funny comparing the two. When it comes to my mental state and the type of relaxation and stress management I need, 24% Bacopa is amazing. It's probably, and I have a hard time admitting this to myself because I've been a long time ashwagandha fan. I've taken it for probably 8 years at this point, almost daily. Shodan being my recent favorite for the last 4 years or so since we came out with it, and I've basically always taken it. It's always been my favorite for balancing stress levels. But I think now, especially in this new environment, Bacopa 24% has kind of taken the crown. So I've dropped my Shodan, I'm just taking this, and I'm feeling great on it. I'm getting some of the benefits of Cognance, but I'm missing that sparkle. So my next step is actually going to be to do the 24% Bacopa and stack it with Cognance. So getting a more full spectrum effect, getting more of those jujubogenin, pseudo-jujubogenin, GABAergic, and stress modulating effects, and stacking them with the more 5-HT2A effects of Cognance and the muscarinic acetylcholine effects of Cognance. And you can hear all about that in our Cognance episode and the Cognance blog, but it really gives a unique effect. It's subtle in a weird way. If you really take it and you think you're going to go on an adventure with it, like isoliquid, you won't. It is subtle in a sense, But it is almost like Alexander Shulgin said at one point, pharmacological tofu. Like it can make other things work better. So for example, if you take Cognance and you stack it together with saffron works better and Cognance works better. And there's more of this sensory enhancement effect. And same thing if you stack Subroxy and Cognance together. Both of them work better. So it is a really unique one in that sense, that the effects are subtle, but they're pronounced. And they are very good to work into stacks. Bacopa 24% attracts way more attention to itself. It's like the bigger, badder version of Cognance. I would say if any of you are really into wines, like sometimes you have a wine that is super oaky and super concentrated and you drink it and it's just like you're getting clubbed over the head with red wine flavor. And then
wood juice, as we call it sometimes.
And sometimes it's impressive and it's fun, especially when it's a little bit cold out and it's one of those comforting wines. But sometimes you want one that's more subtle. It takes a little bit more time to get to know, and you smell it, and there's more aromatic complexities going on.
Or rock juice, as we like to call
rock
it.
Juice, very mineral-heavy wines.
Yeah.
We're recently into wines from Savoy, if you're also a wine nerd, which can be very mineralic, but also have very interesting aromatics. I would say in this scenario, the Bacopa 24% is like that big wood juice wine, comforting. Like it makes you feel good. You just drink it and it just kind of puts a smile on your face, but it doesn't really engage some of the higher centers of your brain to think a little bit more deeply.
As opposed to Cognance, which I would say is more similar to the rock juice side, and perhaps a Jura or a Savoy wine, which has a lot more subtlety and some great aroma, and definitely a lot of variety in how the mouthfeel might be. Just there's a detail and there's a beautiful fine quality to this kind of wine, but also to the kind of effects that we get from Cognance that you are just not going to get from a traditional Bacopa extract.
So I would say as a beginner, you've never taken Bacopa and you really want to experience some big, robust, remarkable effects that don't have a lot of complexity and don't necessarily enhance cognition as much, then Bacopa 24% is great. It's really good and I really love it. But if you want a more complex effect, you've been around nootropics for a lot longer, you're looking for that really unique thing to kind of push the boundaries of what's possible with natural supplements, Cognance is kind of unbeatable in my opinion.
I think so too. Or if you're a person who just can't handle the super calming effect of the Bacopa 24% or our other Bacopa extracts, because that tired, lethargy-inducing effect can be really frustrating, and it turned me off from Bacopa for a very long time until I started taking Cognance, and again still. But Cognance I don't have that problem with at all, and I'm glad that I can experience the benefits from Cognance, because I think Bacopa is a really fascinating botanical.
Yeah. And again, if you do really like those effects, you can take it at night, and it enhances your sleep quality, and it has nootropic effects. And that's kind of where things start getting more complex and interesting. But before we get there, it has now been about half an hour maybe since you took the Cyanidin 3-glucoside. Are you noticing anything different?
Well, I'm starting to get hungry, but I mean, that might not be just from the Cyanidin 3-glucoside. It could also be from the fact that we've been filming the podcast for almost 2 hours. But I do notice some stimulation. I notice that I'm starting to feel hungry. I notice that I have...
Which I get from Cyanidin 3-glucoside.
Yeah, I do too. Yeah, that's definitely an effect that I noticed when I was taking it every day. I do think that it has kind of perked me up a little bit more. I feel more awake. I don't have this kind of heavy feeling around my eyes and like my head. That's something I get sometimes from Bacopa. This feeling of sleepiness, and it just kind of like is concentrated around this part of my body. I think from the Cyanidin 3-glucoside, I'm feeling like it's easier to sit up straight, and I feel a little bit more motivated. I have a little bit more of that edge that I like to have mentally and physically. So it's definitely a nice combination, and I think I could feel it actually coming up over time. And as I was listening to you talk about the process of going from a traditional Bacopa extract to Cognance, I was able to follow along the whole time, stay engaged, and I think that the Cyanidin 3-glucoside, that stimulation, definitely helps to balance out the relaxation of the Bacopa, because when I feel that kind of like super chill, lethargy-inducing effect from Bacopa, it makes it hard to focus. So having that stimulation from Cyanidin 3-glucoside then kind of brings me back in, which is really good. And it's not having this kind of over-the-top effect. Like, I don't feel like I need to run and use the bathroom. I definitely feel a little bit warmer. That might just be the environment.
But that's definitely something Cyanidin 3-glucoside has. I don't know if you can see it on the camera, but there is some sweat beading on my forehead because it is a little bit warm in this room. It is summer. You don't have AC in the Netherlands in the summer, so this room is quite warm. And Cyanidin 3-glucoside definitely has thermogenic effects. It's something we talk about in the podcast, but it is really like, I've been taking Cyanidin 3-glucoside and you haven't, and I've noticeably been sweating more.
Yeah, although I don't sweat much at all, generally speaking.
But I normally don't either.
Yeah.
So normally I'm not sweating very often, but when I take Cyanidin 3-glucoside, especially in this more humid climate, I sweat a lot.
Yeah.
And especially, like, I hardly ever get sweat on my forehead in that kind of area. Like, the rest of my body still feels kind of dry.
When we're eating Szechuan food, you definitely do, but that's like, that can be pretty extreme in terms of spiciness.
Yes,
yeah.
then for sure. But normally, so I think that's something to the thermogenic effects of Cyanidin 3-glucoside. But one interesting thing pharmacologically with Bacopa is that it can dampen norepinephrine levels in the brain. I think this is also why it's not a good fit for certain people. A lot of people actually need a little bit more norepinephrine. It's good for mood, it's good for motivation, it's good for feeling focused and engaged. So some people actually notice negative mood effects when they take normal Bacopa extracts. And part of that might be because it is dampening norepinephrine. But if you look at it in terms of stress, norepinephrine also can go up when you're stressed, together with cortisol and other stress hormones, and that can make you feel kind of stimulated and on edge. And then if you're stacking that with something like Cyanidin 3-glucoside, which is preventing much of the breakdown of norepinephrine, then that effect can get really extreme. And I think that's something I was experiencing because I was taking Cyanidin 3-glucoside, tiger milk, which is likely increasing norepinephrine a little bit, the cold showers, which definitely increase norepinephrine, and then also just experiencing a lot of daily stress with work and just general life being settling down here again. And that kind of made it go over the top for me. When I introduced Bacopa, normal Bacopa, that started to get better, but still a little bit over the top. So then I started stacking, or I actually took away Cyanidin 3-glucoside and tiger milk and the cold showers, and then just Bacopa, and then it was good. And then I started getting a little bit tired. Then I added back in Cyanidin 3-glucoside, and it was perfect. So there's a nice balancing effect on norepinephrine there. And in terms of for caffeine, for example, caffeine can produce spikes in dopamine and norepinephrine, which can make you feel a little bit jittery. And Bacopa can actually prevent that from happening. So that's another good way to use it. If you have some caffeine in your system and it's making you jittery, Bacopa Monnieri might be good to smooth it out, similar to L-theanine. So maybe like a more nootropic L-theanine in that sense. Another thing Bacopa is doing is it is modulating serotonin quite a bit. So you have this enzyme called tryptophan hydroxylase, which takes dietary L-tryptophan that we get from protein sources. And tryptophan hydroxylase takes L-tryptophan, hydroxylates it, and turns it into 5-hydroxytryptophan, 5-HTP. And then 5-HTP is turned into serotonin. So that's how you end up with serotonin. Tryptophan hydroxylase is what you call a rate-limiting enzyme. So it can get saturated pretty quickly. You can keep throwing L-tryptophan at it, but it won't keep metabolizing or turning L-tryptophan into hydroxylated L-tryptophan in order to make more serotonin. The process going from 5-HTP to serotonin is not rate limited. So if you end up with 5-HTP, you can make not unlimited amounts of serotonin, but much more. By taking something like Bacopa, you can actually increase the capacity to make more serotonin from dietary sources. And I think that's really interesting. So this extra serotonin can then have a very interesting mood boosting effect too. But another interesting attribute of Bacopa monnieri is that it seems to enhance serotonin transporter density. So this is something that usually when we're enhancing serotonin levels, we are blocking the serotonin transporter. So the serotonin transporter usually takes the serotonin away from the synaptic cleft and back into the neuron. So it's kind of fascinating that Bacopa monnieri is both enhancing serotonin levels by speeding up its synthesis, but additionally, it is also enhancing the clearance of serotonin by enhancing the density of the serotonin transporter. If you've been around long enough, you might know of one other compound that might actually have a serotonin transporter density enhancing effect. We won't mention that on here. The FDA does not like that one. But this can also have an interesting mood boosting effect, basically being able to release serotonin and get rid of it more quickly while also having more serotonin around. So that can kind of get around some of the negatives that you might have with blocking the serotonin transporter, because not everyone responds well to serotonin transporter blockade, but you still get the benefit of more serotonin, which some people can definitely react well to. Another thing in terms of serotonin that's happening with Bacopa monnieri is that it seems to kind of act almost as an adaptogen at the 5-HT2C serotonin receptor. So when 5-HT2C levels are going way up, it can normalize the 5-HT2C levels. And that's interesting because 5-HT2C controls dopamine release. It is a big player in mood, but also in GABAergic activity throughout the brain. So I think that's a fascinating aspect of the serotonergic effects too. Another thing it does, which I'm having a bit of a hard time wrapping my head exactly around what this is doing, is it is enhancing the density of the 5-HT3A receptor. If you've been around long enough, you probably also know that ginger is a very famous 5-HT3A antagonist. So it is by antagonizing the 5-HT3A receptor, it is preventing nausea from happening, because when serotonin binds to the 5-HT3A receptor, it can actually produce nausea. So blocking it is a good thing to do to prevent nausea from happening. But on the other hand, 5-HT3A is also important for neuroplasticity and for mood and memory. So it seems that part of the beneficial effects, especially on memory too, with Bacopa monnieri, are maybe due to the 5-HT3A density enhancing effects, coupled with the tryptophan hydroxylase enzyme activity enhancing effects and enhancing the density of the serotonin transporter. So there's a lot of interesting serotonergic stuff going on there. And then if you look at Cognance is acting as a positive allosteric modulator at the 5-HT2A serotonin receptor. The one thing I'm not completely sure of is which compound in Bacopa monnieri is enhancing the tryptophan hydroxylase activity and increasing the density of the serotonin transporter. Are those effects still in Cognance as well? And based on my experience with Cognance, I don't think so. And based with my experience with regular Bacopa, I do think that's really happening. So maybe that's what the jujubogenin and pseudojujubogenin is doing. And I think I actually read a study about Sisyphus jujuba, where they showed that through jujubogenin, there is some modulation of serotonergic activity. So I think that's maybe one other aspect, combining Bacopa 24% or Synapsa or Bacognize together with Cognance could result in some very interesting synergy, which is kind of mind-blowing to think about, that two different extracts or two different processes of the same plant, when combined, could actually have synergistic effects. And I think you see this oftentimes too. Sometimes, like, a certain compound is being extracted and concentrated and then being added back in. For example, Subroxy, I think they are making a much stronger Roxylin A extract and maybe even turning some of the bicholine into Roxylin A and then adding the Roxylin A back in. I've never actually been able to verify this, but reading through some of the Subroxy patents, it seems that that's maybe what they're doing. So instead of just going with pure Roxylin A, they are mixing it back with the source material to create a more full spectrum effect. And that seems to be working in their favor. So maybe combining Cognance together with Bacopa monnieri, especially something like the 24%, could be a very interesting way of synergizing the plant with two different components.
Absolutely. And we talked about this in last month's podcast episode, which was about lion's mane mycelium. And you talked about a nice stack idea, which was the lion's mane 8-to-1, and then to stack it with the lion's mane mycelium. And that sounds like a really interesting stack. Still haven't had a chance to try it yet, but that's the same concept, right? To get something that's more full spectrum and to still get the benefits of both distinct extracts. Absolutely. Or distinct products.
And there you have something different happening. You have two different life cycles that are producing two different compounds. Here, in a sense, you have two different life cycles too. One that's the plant itself, and one that's the plant after it's been through a human body.
Yeah, or that's the sort of effect that is happening with the hydrolysis and the acid hydrolysis for Cognance.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that's interesting. If you take into account all of those serotonergic effects, then the 5-HT2A positive allosteric modulator effects of Cognance and the muscarinic acetylcholine positive allosteric modulator effects, the M1 positive allosteric modulator effects of Cognance, together with some of the serotonergic effects of regular Bacopa, I think makes for a really interesting stack. Another thing that it's doing is it is dampening and regulating HPA axis activity. So that's kind of the stress center of the brain. And it is controlling cortisol and corticosterone and other stress hormones. So in that sense, Bacopa is a real adaptogen because it is modulating stress levels through actually acting on the stress hormones. And I think that's why I really like Bacopa 24%. And I might even am liking it a little bit more than Shodan. I think Shodan has a slightly stronger effect on cortisol. Bacopa 24% less so, and I think a slightly stronger GABAergic effect. So for stress, it's almost like a little bit of a milder thing than Shodan. So I think when stress levels are really high, I would switch back to Shodan. When stress levels are kind of like parked nicely where they are now, not too high, not too low, Bacopa is working perfectly, especially with something like Cyanidin 3-glucoside, enhancing norepinephrine levels a little bit, and this keeping that in check. So that's the adaptogenic effect together with the serotonergic effects definitely is going to have an interesting mood boosting adaptogenic effect. And then we get to GABA, and it's doing a really interesting thing with GABA. It is enhancing GABA receptor density according to some studies. And I think this is also why some people take Bacopa monnieri to 24%, the Bacognize, the Synapsa, and they feel fine on it for a week. And then they start getting tired. So one thing that's happening after that week, cortisol levels might be really low. That might be making you tired. But another thing, GABA receptor density is going up. You start becoming more sensitive to the effects of GABA. Some people, when they take GABAergic supplements, they simply get really tired. So they might already have fairly high GABA receptor density. And someone like myself, who clearly doesn't have very high GABA receptor density and is very receptive to GABAergics, I can basically take a GABAergic at any point in the day, never feel tired, and it always makes me feel better. Otherwise, I feel a little bit on edge. So a GABAergic is always part of my stack. And something like Bacopa monnieri is then very interesting because it is actually increasing the density of GABA receptors, making me more sensitive potentially to other GABAergics, but also to my body's own GABA. And I think that's also a reason why maybe I'm now a little bit more sensitive to the GABAergic effects of Shodan. And the combination makes me tired. So that's another thing to keep in mind. If you are taking Bacopa and you're taking other GABAergics, Bacopa might be making you more sensitive to the other GABAergics. And with that in mind, maybe Bacopa isn't necessarily making you sleepier. The other existing GABAergic supplements are just making you sleepier because you're more sensitive to them. But I think for a long-term GABAergic option, Bacopa is very interesting, especially because through jujubogenin and pseudojujubogenin, it also seems to have a very direct GABAergic effect.
Yeah. This reminds me of when I took GABA, just plain GABA by itself, and I really didn't enjoy it. It was not my favorite feeling, although it did make me feel kind of giddy in some way or slightly giggly, but the physical effect was not so pleasant for me. I found it to be a little bit too relaxing, and similar to the Bacopa 24%, it kind of makes me feel like I'm sitting on a very comfy couch, even if I'm just going about my daily life. And that's not really a feeling that I like to have, because it takes away some of the clarity that I like to experience.
And that's kind of when we go back to the wine analogy, the big, woody, wood soup, comforting, big, bold wine with little complexity, kind of that sitting on the couch kind of vibe. Same thing with the Bacopa. It has a very enveloping effect. And same thing with the GABA. And I personally really like that effect if I'm stacking it with other things that is adding that kind of more focus and complexity and clarity back in.
Yeah.
If I were to just take Bacopa 24%, it wouldn't be my favorite. And Cognance would provide that just by itself, taking nothing else. But in stacks, it works well. And I think stacking it together with Cognance is going to work well too.
So speaking of stacks, since you've talked extensively about the pharmacology of Bacopa, we've covered so many different things.
I think we do the last just pharmacology
thing.
If you can bear with me a little bit longer. I know it can get a little bit in depth. The one thing with Bacopa is that you have to take it for at least 2 to 4 weeks to start noticing the memory enhancing effects. And this is because through those GABAergic pathways, serotonergic pathways, but also direct effects on increasing BDNF levels, Bacopa has a neuroplasticity enhancing effect. And neuroplasticity is a physical process that takes some time, but it helps enhance memory. But because it takes some time, the memory enhancing effects of Bacopa do take quite a bit longer to kick in. Most people notice it after about 4 weeks. So you have to basically take it for a month. If you can handle the relaxing GABAergic effects, great. You're going to have an amazing time for 4 weeks, and then you're going to get these great memory boosts. If that is not your cup of tea, you're not going to have a great 4 weeks, and then you're better off looking at something like Cognance or taking the Bacopa at night, because those neuroplasticity effects build up over time. You can take it at night, benefit from the sleep promoting effects, and still get the memory enhancing effects.
Do you think that the memory enhancing effects go away when you stop taking Bacopa?
It will be there for maybe another month or 2.
Okay.
And then it will probably start to go down a little bit. But that neuroplasticity, once you kickstart that process, it's going to be around for quite a bit.
Okay.
So you could also maybe take it for a month and then not for 2 weeks and then a month and then not for 2 weeks. Yeah. Although I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. Just if you handle it well, just keep taking it. The one thing I notice, so if I take Cognance, I feel like my short-term memory is a little bit better. I feel a little bit sharper. And after some time, my long-term memory definitely improves significantly. One thing I don't have with Cognance, that I do have with Bacopa Monnieri and other people have with Bacopa Monnieri, is that I can just be sitting somewhere and get a whiff of a smell or hear a song or just like feel some sort of emotion that then causes a memory to flash into my head from like 10, 20 years ago.
Oh, wow.
Which is kind of a novelty. And you hear other people talking about this with Bacopa. Like you might just be sitting around and just have an old memory flash into your head with extreme vividness.
Wow.
Fun. Yeah. Maybe good for emotional health. But in terms of the nootropics effects, not super useful.
Yeah.
It is allowing me to remember things more clearly work-related. So it definitely has a beneficial nootropic effect. But I actually think that the memory-enhancing effects of Cognance are more streamlined. I don't have that weird effect with it. So that's good. Another thing I'm noticing after taking it for like a month and a half is my dreams are much more vivid. And in my dreams, there are old memories there sometimes.
Okay.
But I've been having it recently. I smelled something the other day and it just took me back like 20 years very vividly. It's cool.
Yeah,
but
very cool.
If that's not your cup of tea, then Bacopa. But it can be cool, especially if you're trying to remember some old stuff. Maybe you have fond memories with people that aren't around anymore, and you can think back to those days and remember it. That might help with an emotional healing process or something if you've lost a loved one. I can imagine it could be kind of therapeutic in that sense.
Yeah.
But it is something I consistently hear with Bacopa. I do think it is kind of something that speaks to the memory enhancing effects, even enhancing memories that you've already made and are just in the background. And now they're coming out more.
That's
I never had that with Cognance after months of taking it. But with Cognance, my short-term memory, my more functional memory is significantly better. And I think with that in mind, combining the two would be interesting, because clearly not all of the memory enhancing effects are coming from ebelin lactone and the other bacogenins. There is also something in Bacopa that is doing that. And we've mainly talked about the saponins, the bacosides, but there are also alkaloids in there and different compounds that there's no reference standards for it. No one's standardizing for them, but there is a lot more in Bacopa than just the bacosides. So those things might get destroyed during acid hydrolysis because not everything is stable during acid hydrolysis. So with that in mind, you might be getting something in Bacopa that is further memory enhancing that you're not getting in Cognance, but Cognance is cleaner, it's more functional, it has this unique sparkle and mood boosting effect that you just don't really get with Bacopa 24% or Cognance or Cognizin. Wait.
Bacognize.
Bacognize.
Yes. Yeah.
Or Synapsa.
Okay.
And I think just also to summarize it, since we have kind of gone through all of the pharmacology, now choosing an extract.
Yeah.
I think Synapsa, Bacognize, and Bacopa 24% are all going to be more similar than not.
Okay.
They're all going to produce a calming effect. If you are lethargy prone, they're probably all not going to be the best fit for you during the day. They're all going to have a slightly more robust GABAergic and serotonergic effect. And then it's just about different strengths and slightly different effects. So I think just the strongest overall is clearly the Bacopa at 24%. It is very strong. You will definitely notice it if you take it. It might be too much for you. Yeah. Bacognize, I feel like, is kind of the middle of the road Bacopa. It's not super specialized. It kind of just feels like Bacopa 24%, but turned down a notch. And maybe ever so slightly more mood boosting, but I personally get the most mood boost from Bacopa 24%, but that is one thing I've seen going for Bacognize. So I might be making Bacognize seem like a boring product, but I think for a lower standardization, maybe slightly more full spectrum product, Bacognize is very interesting. And it is definitely good if something like the Bacopa 24% is too strong for you, then Bacognize would be a perfect fit. Synapsa is kind of going a little bit more in the direction of Cognance. Okay. It is a little bit more specialized. There is many, many years of extraction knowledge and standardization knowledge and research there. And they seem to somehow be focusing on the bacogenins, which would include ebelin lactone. A lot of people mention that Synapsa is significantly less lethargy inducing, although for most there is still a lethargy effect with it, but it has a little bit more of that sparkle that Cognance has. But it's not there. It's like maybe 5% of the way there when compared to Cognance. Cognance is a whole different thing. So then that brings us to Cognance. Yeah. Cognance being you don't respond well to Bacopa, to the relaxing effects. You don't want to take it at night, and you want to take something during the day that has a very unique, complex kind of, you really have to think about it, and it makes you think about it, and it makes you process things differently. It has a sensory enhancement effect. You kind of want that next level of Bacopa. Then Cognance is clearly for you. If you want kind of a big, robust, punchy effect, again, look towards something like 24% Bacopa. It will kick in harder. If you know what you want to experience, if you've been around nootropics for a long time, just go for the Cognance. I think you will be very impressed with it. Just don't expect to be cruising away on a missile somewhere.
Yeah.
Then look more for something like Bacopa, 24%. Like, it can be very kind of jarring when it first kicks in. When it first kicked in early in the podcast after 45 minutes, I thought, oh yeah, there it goes. And I never really have that with Cognance, but with Cognance, you will stop yourself at a certain point and just go, wow, like everything is so much more vibrant, and I feel more focused and clear-headed and clarity. I think it is the superior nootropic, and it's way easier to stack with. And I think people that are taking something like Cognance are likely more advanced nootropic users, and they are combining Cognance in a stack of other things. So it's easier to stack with. It can, especially if you have a really large stack, Cognance is superior, I think. But that's kind of like a quick breakdown of all of them, ranking them from strength, Bacopa 24%, then probably Bacognize, Synapsa, and then you have Cognance here in its own little world, because it's not the same thing at all.
No, definitely not. So that was an incredible amount of information and detail and description. You really covered all of the bases for the benefits that we can expect from Bacopa, as well as the differences between the products that we offer. And I think this will be a really helpful guide for anyone who is looking for a Bacopa supplement, perhaps for the first time, or if you have tried one of our products, one of our Bacopa extracts, and you're looking for something a little bit different. This is super helpful, and it's really amazing to be able to compare a couple of different extracts to each other, because there is a lot of this pharmacology talk and the benefits that we just wouldn't explore if it weren't for these different options that we have to choose from. So if you ever feel overwhelmed, or if you're curious, you can always refer back to this podcast, and especially this section at the end, and do a little bit of a comparison for yourself ahead of time. And then, of course, as we always say, try it for yourself and really pay attention to what you notice from the supplement, and, you know, give yourself some credit also with what you're experiencing and how it might be affecting your stress levels or your mood.
And that you might be changing.
Yes.
Because I used to get tired from Bacopa, and I was a little bit nervous taking Bacopa 24% every day. And it works perfect. So even though I have had negative experiences with it in the past, like 6 years ago, 6 years later, my brain has changed enough where this is now exactly what I'm looking for. So keep an open mind there too.
Definitely. And speaking of keeping an open mind, I think it's time to get a little creative and go into the last part of the podcast, which is talking about stacks that we can make with the Bacopa extract. So I think because we've already done a podcast about Cognance, we've talked about extensive stack options with Cognance, let's focus on the Bacopa 24% Bacosides product and what would be good to stack with that.
And keep in mind that I'm making stacks with the Bacopa 24%, but you can do these stacks with Bacognize or Synapsa. I'm just a little bit biased because in the realm of normal Bacopa extracts, the 24% Bacopa is my favorite.
Yeah.
So this is the one I have the most current experience with, and I can suggest some nice stacks there. But feel free to just, like we said in that last section, keep that in mind and think about that when you're choosing a different Bacopa maybe to stack. Like, you want a little bit more specialized effects, do these stacks with Synapsa. You want maybe a little bit more full spectrum mood boosting effects, choose Bacognize. If you want just the most comprehensive, strongest one, 24%. So with that in mind, one of the stacks I want to make is actually Bacopa 24%, Cognance, saffron, and Sabroxy.
And for what specific purpose or what kind of overall benefit do you want from this stack?
Focus, mood, and memory.
Okay.
So this would be a very comprehensive nootropic stack that's going to hit a lot of different areas. Actually, let's make it slightly more complex. So Bacopa 24%, Cognance, saffron, Sabroxy, cyanidin 3-glucoside.
Okay.
So I think some of the components in there, like Sabroxy and cyanidin 3-glucoside, can be really good for mood, memory, focus, but can make people feel on edge a little bit.
Yeah.
And you want something to kind of help dampen that. The thing to dampen it then is the Bacopa 24%. But you also want a little bit more on that sensory enhancement, the little sparkle. The saffron and the Cognance will bring that. So together, that's a very comprehensive stack where you're getting lots of different benefits, and also something we didn't necessarily get all too deep into with Bacopa monnieri, but it is very neuroprotective. It has inflammation and oxidation balancing effects throughout the body and in the brain. And a lot of these other things do too. Cyanidin 3-glucoside does, for example, and saffron does too. So there's a very wide spectrum of effects that can be beneficial there. So that would be my comprehensive nootropic stack, let's call it that.
Okay. I think then the comprehensive nootropic stack would certainly be good for daytime. It would be good for work. It would be good for doing work that requires a lot of focus and a lot of intensity, using all of your mental capacity. But on the flip side, to speak from personal experience and how Bacopa works for me, because it makes me so tired, I'm going to put together a relaxation and before sleep stack.
Is it, by the way, it makes you very relaxed, but is it a nice relaxation? Like, is it the kind of relaxation where you're like, I want to sit and watch a movie? Or is it like the relaxation where you're just like, I want to go to bed?
In this context, I would say that it's the relaxation that makes me feel a little bit more passive. Like, I find myself so relaxed that I don't feel quite as eager or have the urge to jump in and ask so many questions. Like, I feel more comfortable just sitting back and listening. I mean, part of that's because the incredible complexity of what we're talking about, but the other part is that it does kind of tone down this sort of impulsive part of my personality. And there are certain situations in which I like that, but not on an everyday basis. And so that kind of relaxation is something that would fit for watching a movie or maybe going to a museum or something, in terms of like daytime activities. But in terms of socializing, it definitely makes me feel like more of an introvert, because I feel more relaxed to just sit and listen and experience what's happening rather than like participate and be a part of it. And that's just not something that I really want in my daily stack.
Okay. Yeah. So with that in mind then, where's your relaxation stack going?
So my relaxation stack would be going toward a place where like you're taking the stack before you go to sleep, or you're taking the stack before you're doing like a nighttime routine. And we often watch a movie or watch a show before going to sleep. And so I think having the Bacopa 24% is definitely going to help me fall asleep. I also think that taking Shodan is also going to be really relaxing. And this is something I take during the daytime, but I do think the combination is going to be ultra relaxing. And then another product that I would like to take or add to this stack would be something that's really physically relaxing. And there are some products that I've taken in the past as a part of my stack, but at the moment, what's the most physically relaxing product that you can think of that comes to mind first?
I would say the supercritical coriander, but you kind of have a paradoxical stimulation effect with that sometimes. Or tetrahydromagnolol is very good for physical relaxation.
Yeah, physical relaxation. Or even isoliquitogenin actually could be an interesting combo.
To me, isoliquitogenin is stimulating enough where it will keep me up if I take it late at night.
Okay, so fair enough. I haven't experimented so much with that one, but it does just have a really pleasant and wonderful mood effect. So I think in terms of like, going to sleep with like a nice relaxed state of mind and mood, that could be nice, but perhaps it is a little bit too stimulating.
Maybe some GABA.
Yeah, GABA. You could just go completely like stacking the GABA. So you could do the Bacopa 24%, you could do GABA, and you could do Shodan. And that would be extremely relaxing. And I think that would put me to sleep pretty quickly.
And I'll take that a little bit further and go for the lights out stack, which would be Bacopa 24%, supercritical coriander extract, oleamide, magnolia bark, and tetrahydromagnolol. I think those together would really put you out.
Okay. So now let's move on to our last stack of the podcast.
Mm-hmm. And of course, we couldn't do a Bacopa Monnieri podcast without talking about a memory stack.
Yes.
Because that's kind of the thing Bacopa Monnieri is most well known for. So because Bacopa Monnieri is one of the original natural nootropics, I think it would be really cool to combine it with one of the original nootropic stacks in the nootropics community, which is the Mr. Happy stack. This is a stack that combines things like alpha-GPC, fish oil, and uridine that is really catered towards enhancing memory and mood as well. So I think that would stack really well with Bacopa 24%, especially because the effects of omega tau definitely take a few weeks to kick in as well. So they will both kind of be in that same trajectory where you have to take them for a while, but then over time the effects are going to get stronger and stronger. And for that, you could definitely use Bacopa 24% if you can handle the effects of Bacopa 24%. But if it makes you a little bit tired, there's two things you could do. You could either take omega tau during the day and then Bacopa 24% at night, or you could switch out the Bacopa 24% for Cognance, of course.
And I was thinking, if you really wanted to take it all the way into super mega nootropic territory, why not just do Bacopa 24%, Cognance, and omega tau all together?
That would be great. And in that sense too, if you react well to Bacopa 24%, take Bacopa 24%, Cognance, and omega tau all at the same time. If you don't respond well to Bacopa 24% during the day, but you do at night, then take omega tau, Cognance, and then Bacopa 24% at night. So that would be a really nice nootropic memory enhancing synergy there. Mm-hmm. And then of course, going to the other side, combining old with new, Erinaceus. Erinaceus has always been one of the things that the nootropics community has been very excited about having, even almost 10 years ago, but we never really had it until now with Erinaceus, where we actually have a product that is genuinely standardized to 0.5% Erinacine A. Mm-hmm. And it's having memory-enhancing effects. So combining Erinaceus with Bacopa 24% and maybe even Cognance and omega tau, I think would make a very well-rounded old and new school nootropic stack. And I think that's a great one to end it on. What do you think?
Yeah, for sure. It's actually a combination that I think would be really interesting to try. And the conversations that we've had about memory and your experience of these old memories coming flashing back to you, it makes me want to take Bacopa 24%, but at nighttime, because I can't say that I've experienced that specific effect with a nootropic supplement before, but I want to. I really want to know what's kind of hiding out in the background. Yeah. And that's a really exciting and kind of different note to end on for this podcast, because we talked a lot about the different benefits that you can experience from Bacopa supplements, and we've talked about choosing the right Bacopa supplement for you. But another part of the podcast that we really love is also just sharing some of these anecdotes and our personal experience with these products with you. And I think this podcast is a really great example of how different one product can be for Emil versus for me, and the same thing might be with you. So if you've been taking Bacopa for a long time and you really love it, we would love to hear your experience and what that's like for you and how it's benefited you on Reddit. And our Reddit is r/nootropicsdepot. And we also love to hear your experience with products and supplements in the YouTube comments. So definitely let us know what you're taking, what's in your stack, and if you've tried Cognance or if you prefer one of the other Bacopa supplements. We always are excited to see what you have to say in the comments. So thank you so much for listening to the In Search of Insight podcast. Every month it's an adventure, and we get into some serious science and some serious knowledge, and we're so glad to share it with you. So definitely subscribe, share the podcast with your friends, and get ready for a very, very full and knowledge-dense podcast for next month when we return with episode 24. That's going to be 2 years of the In Search of Insight podcast, and we're just going to keep going up and up from here. So with that, we'll say goodbye and see you next time.
See ya. Bye.